What do you think? Is this working? Can y'all hear me? All right. Hopefully this stays with us. Thank you so much, Richard, for such a warm welcome. It is an honor truly to be here in your beautifully renovated building, and it feels fitting to be at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library ahead of the upcoming Juneteenth holiday. I am Emily Ramshaw. I'm the co-founder and CEO of the 19th.
And I'm Amanda Zamora, co-founder and publisher of the 19th. We are so excited to welcome you to the third and final day of our third annual 19th Represents Summit. And for those of you joining us in person here in Washington, D.C., we'd like to welcome you to the first ever in-person event in the 19th's history. It is really wonderful to see your faces in the flesh.
So we've spent the last 2 days of our summit unpacking Title IX and its anniversary, from its history to its impact. We have certainly celebrated its successes. Today, we are here together to talk about the work that continues with a truly incredible lineup of speakers across public policy, sports, and the law. Before we kick off today's programming, I want to thank those who have made this week possible, including our presenting sponsors, the Impact Seat Foundation and the Walton Family Foundation, and our supporting sponsors, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, the Girls' Rights Project, the Lumina Foundation, and the Tory Burch Foundation.
We would also like to thank our media partner, USA Today, our academic partner, Arizona State University, and our community partner, the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library.
All right, without further ado, we're going to jump into our first conversation, and hopefully we've got some of these technical snafus worked out. We are so pleased to introduce the 19th's Washington correspondent, Amanda Becker, who will interview the 12th U.S. Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona. Yep.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. Okay, I think it's on, so we can get started. So we're really thrilled at the 19th to have Secretary Cardona here with us today. No discussion about Title IX would be complete without hearing from the Education Department. Secretary Cardona has basically had experience in every facet of the education system. He was a grade school teacher, a principal, an assistant superintendent, a professor of education, and education commissioner for Connecticut. Did I miss anything?
I think the title that I take most pride in is a dad, too.
I was just going to say he also has two children who I believe are still school age. So, you really have seen this kind of from all angles. And I know that this is our first panel today. Some people may have tuned in on the first 2 days that were virtual, but I did want to just start with kind of hearing what is Title IX from you, kind of from the Education Secretary directly. What is Title IX? What does it cover? What's its importance?
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda, for this opportunity here to speak with you a little bit about Title IX. Thank you, Richard, for hosting here at the library. And thank all of you who are here in person, who are listening. Title IX is one of the most important things we can support and stand by in the Department of Education. It means access, opportunity and access. That's what it means. 50 years of opportunity and access and progress. That's what it means to me. Free from education, free from sex discrimination, period. Right? And we see it manifest in different ways, but at the end of the day, this is about opportunities for students across the country. So in its fundamental core, that's what it is to me, access and opportunity for students.
So I think probably a lot of us think about sports when we think about Title IX. It's much broader than that. And could you maybe give us an example of another area where Title IX would come in to kind of protect the rights of students?
Of course. For example, STEM fields. We know there are so many jobs and opportunities in the STEM fields, yet our classes are not always balanced, and they're getting better. I recently learned 65% of postgraduates in higher education in the biology sciences are women.
Oh, wow.
65%, that's amazing. But in the math and other computer science fields, it's only 20%. So, to me, Title IX, while we focus a lot on athletics, and it's important that we make sure in athletics there's also opportunity, we have to remember that it goes beyond athletics. It's about educational opportunities, period. Access to higher level courses, to rigor, to extracurricular activities, to programming that we know are critical in the whole child experience, high school child experience. So, yes, athletics often gets a lot of the headlines. It goes beyond that.
Maybe my mic's okay, so that's good. So how does the education department come in? Obviously, you enforce Title IX. Could you talk about a little bit about the enforcement process and kind of how the department interfaces with Title IX, making sure it's implemented properly, whether that's through proactive measures or enforcement measures?
Sure. You know, I always think about in educational leadership the principle of reciprocity, right? Equal amounts of support and accountability. So we'll get to the accountability in a second, because that's also what people think of when they think of the Department of Education. But we have a responsibility to build capacity in the field on how to implement Title IX effectively, how to create a culture of self-regulation so that it's not just relying on enforcement. Last year, we held the first of its kind national hearing where we listened to families and parents and stakeholders about this. We've done webinars, we've done outreach to the field on what it means to implement Title IX. But when it comes to enforcement, when we receive complaints, concerns, or requests for investigation, we have the Office for Civil Rights that investigates violations of civil rights that also include violations to Title IX. And I have to tell you, post-pandemic, I say post-pandemic, while we're still in the pandemic, the number of cases that we've received for investigations has increased. It went from like 10,000 to 15,000 across the country. So enforcement is critically important, and we're proud. We're so proud out of the Office for Civil Rights that some of the work that we've done as recently as last week, you might have read, enforcement and protecting the rights of a pregnant college student who her rights were violated in terms of accommodations that were needed for her to be successful. So the enforcement piece is critical, but I also want to focus on it's our responsibility to build capacity, to create a culture of inclusion for women and girls as well.
Do you have any idea? That's really interesting that the cases increased during the pandemic. Do you have any idea why, and what kind of the correlation is there, or the causal effect between educating in the pandemic and the number of cases that you've gotten?
Well, you know, the cases that the requests for investigation that we're getting are varied, right? In many cases, they are cases where parents of children with disabilities feel like the needs were not met, right? But look, I don't have to tell you, look across the country. We're seeing legislation being passed that goes against inclusion, that excludes students. So it's no surprise to me that there's an increase and an uptick. And that's why I'm really proud that the president, in his proposal, requested $26 million increase for the Office for Civil Rights to make sure that we're protecting the rights of our students across the country.
And you mentioned, Secretary, that your offices or department has been undergoing kind of a review for a little bit over a year now of Title IX overall. Now, the previous education secretary under Donald Trump, Betsy DeVos, she made some changes. And I want to talk specifically about some of the changes she made to how sexual assault and harassment is reported at colleges, or I suppose grade schools as well, and high schools. Some of the things she did were she changed, and the department changed the rulemaking, who can file, and that you have to be a current student, for example. Somebody who's graduated couldn't file after graduation, is my understanding. What are some other changes that she made? And then, you know, after that, we'll talk a little bit about kind of the review process that you're undergoing.
Sure, yeah. There were changes made in the last administration that resulted in a lot of concerns being expressed. Particularly from students and advocates of students who felt that they're going to be less likely to report, less likely to want to come forward if they were subjected to sexual violence or discrimination. So we are engaging in that process, and it's probably one of the most important things as secretary that we can engage, that I can engage in and my team can engage in, is the review of this process and the release of the proposed regulations.
There were a couple public hearings about this. What feedback have you gotten from the public, from voters, about changes that they would like you to look at as you undergo this review?
Well, obviously, what you mentioned a little while ago, to combat what many perceive to be the decrease in likelihood that those who have suffered from sexual violence come forward. So those are some of the things that we've heard early on, and when I talk to administrators or students, those are the things that really stand out in the concerns that were expressed to me in my visits. I visited over 34 states and territories in the last year, and when the conversation comes up, what I'm hearing from students, what I'm hearing from families and educators is that.
One of the things that I've seen reported elsewhere, including in, I believe I was reading the Washington Post yesterday, was that adding language about gender identity is under consideration in the rules changes or in the regulation promulgation. In your view, does Title IX already cover transgender students and LGBTQ students, and why would that need to be spelled out more clearly in the Title IX regulations?
Well, I wish I could say more about what we're doing, but obviously I want to respect the process and make sure that we're following the regulatory processes and not really speak to the specifics about what may or may not be in there. What I will tell you is that last year, as we followed the Bostock ruling, we recognized that we need to make sure all students feel included, accepted, and that they all have opportunities regardless of gender identification or where a student is or who they love. All means all, and that's something that I feel very, very passionately about from day one. We want to create inclusive schools, and we've been talking about wanting to create inclusive schools, making sure that all students feel welcomed back. The pandemic was hard enough, right? So for students to come back in and have to deal with whether or not they're going to be accepted or welcomed onto an extracurricular activity or feel like they're an outcast in their own school, that's something that we feel pretty passionately about. I was recently in Florida, and I had a roundtable with families and students who were sharing with me their concern about having to feel like strangers in their own school or not accepted. And it's really important that at the Department of Education that we were very clear, we're unequivocal, we're not, it's black and white. All students should have access to all activities in our schools like every other student.
I assume you were in Florida because of some of the things that have been happening down there related to, there are now 18 states, I checked with my colleagues this morning, that have passed laws related to transgender student participation in sports. Are those laws on a collision course with Title IX, and would you expect those to end up in the courts?
Well, we'll see when the proposed regulations come out. Another thing that I want to mention about this, the regulatory process, that it's really important that people understand. Once we put out the proposed regulations, you might know in February we put them forward to OMB, and now they're in the interagency review process. Once they come out, there's going to be a period of feedback where we're going to take feedback in, and we encourage everyone here, everyone listening, to provide written feedback so that our team could process that and take into account your perspective on it. And then when the final rules are proposed, we expect there to be, this is going to be national, right? So while I can't speak to what'll be in there now, what I will tell you is that federal civil rights protections are federal for everyone across the country.
And if people do want to participate in that and offer feedback, what should they be watching? Should they be watching kind of OMB's website or education's website?
Believe me, you're going to know when we put them out. Believe me, you're going to know.
You'll read
you're
it on
gonna know
19thnews.org.
And we're, at the agency, we're really trying hard to make Title IX something that folks understand, that families understand. For some, it's something that happens in DC, or it has to do with school, and I know there's a Title IX coordinator. You mentioned earlier that I had almost like every role in the schools. I want to make sure that every teacher understands, every parent understands, every school principal understands the importance of Title IX and how to implement it at their level. So what we're going to do is make sure not only that we're going to seek input, but that we're going to publicize it in a way where the stakeholders that we serve understand that we're asking them for their opinion as well.
I know the original aim, and you might not be able to get into too many details because I know everything's still in flux, was to have this ready, the review ready, and the new regulations proposed by, or adopted by the anniversary of Title IX, the 50th anniversary, which is next week. Is that now in OMB's hands or Ed's hands, or how does that work at this point in terms of getting this over the finish line?
Yeah, June 23rd. Again, I want to respect that process, that regulatory process, and there's very few things that are as important at the Department of Education for us to focus on. So it is important for us to move on this, and we are working on it. And as I said earlier, it is in the interagency review process. But as soon as we're able to share information, we're going to share it loudly, and we want to make sure that we're doing so in a way that is respectful to the process, but also engaging stakeholders, because it's going to be a proposed regulation, and we're going to want input. So it's really important that we get it out as quickly as possible, but that we follow the regulatory process and respect that process.
I got a couple of really good questions from people who are watching, so I wanted to turn to those. One of them is from Alexis in Washington, D.C. Is the Department of Education prepared to aggressively pursue Title IX violations by schools, particularly with respect to LGBTQ students? What is Ed's strategy to ensure that countless violations aren't swept under the rug?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Alexis. I think Alexis' question is one that people across the country are waiting to see. Not what I say, but what we do. It's more important what we do than what I say. As I said before, it's not just myself. The president understands the importance of this. In his budget proposal, he's requesting an increase in the Office for Civil Rights budget. That translates into investigators, right? So it's important to note that this budget proposal is intended to ensure that we can protect the rights of our students across the country. And yes, the LGBTQ community has been under attack, unfortunately, and it's my intention as Secretary of Education to fight back, to let those students know that we have their back, and it's more than just rhetoric. We want to follow up on those investigations in a timely way. As I said before, the volume of investigation requests has increased, and our team is working harder than ever before to get it done. I want to give a shout out to the career folks in Office for Civil Rights and the appointed folks who have taken this as a badge of honor to be able to stand up for these students who, after having dealt with the isolation of a pandemic, are going into school environments where people whose responsibility is to provide safe environments are now creating laws to make these students feel further isolated. So we're going to stand up to them, and yes, we're going to put the full force of the Department of Education behind our words and investigate as thoroughly and as swiftly as possible.
Thank you. One quick follow-up from me before we move on to the next audience question. If somebody watching is experiencing discrimination, whether they're LGBTQ or a woman or anyone really, disabled, anyone, what would they need to do to file a complaint with the Education Department to have you look into it?
Yeah. Well, what I would advise them is to seek out the Title IX coordinator in their district. Every district, every higher ed institution has a Title IX coordinator, and that person, number one, should be accessible and should be informed on what the rights of the student are, and should be able to remedy in real time some of the challenges. But the Office for Civil Rights is available for investigations. If you go onto our website, you'll see how to access the Office for Civil Rights to submit a concern and a request for an investigation.
Thank you. This one is from Phyllis in Bethesda, and she said, have you ever seen a pre-K to 12 school district in compliance? Take us on an imaginary school visit and kind of walk us through Title IX regs and policies and how they would apply to a school, and tell us what equity would look, feel, be like.
It's a great way to frame it, Phyllis. What I would say is my vision for that ideal would be that we don't rely, first of all, on federal compliance reviews to be in compliance, that there's a culture of inclusivity where there's adequate professional learning opportunities for the educators. There's partnerships between the schools and the parents where they know who to contact if they have concerns. But that the programming is such that all students, regardless of sex, have access to the extracurricular activities, equal access. So equal opportunities. If little girls want to do extracurricular activities after school, they have the same amount of opportunities or options that the boys have. The fields, the softball fields are right up there with the baseball fields in terms of quality, where their locker rooms, their weight rooms, that this is something that doesn't require a complaint to have equity, that the staff are systematically reviewing access to AP courses, to STEM courses, to the math courses to make sure that there are girls signing up at the rate that they should be, that access to higher education opportunities in those STEM fields are adequate and are appropriate and equal for girls and boys. And then at the college level, that students don't have to fight or talk about Title IX in order to get access to activities. So for me, it's not just about compliance of the technical strategies, but it's creating a culture where all students feel that they're being looked out for, and that the leadership and the policies and the practices that they have in institutions promote inclusivity, promote inclusion of students that are LGBTQ without them having to fight for it. That's the ideal that we should have across the country, and that's something that we're going to continue to fight for.
Well, thank you so much. We're unfortunately out of time, but I think kind of the ideal equitable education scenario is a good place for us to leave this conversation, because that's kind of what we're all aiming for here with Title IX. So thank you so much, Secretary Cardona.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Secretary Cardona. Before we get into our next conversation, I wanted to tell you about a special giveaway happening only during the summit. Our membership manager, Serena Henderson, who you may have met on the way in, has curated a gift basket with Jewel's latest album, some special edition 19th swag, a few of our favorite books, and more. Anyone who signs up for one of our free newsletters over the course of the summit is entered to win. You can find the sign-up form at 19thnews.org/giveaway, or for those watching online, you can scan the QR code on your screen. For folks here, you can sign up at our membership table, which is upstairs in the lobby. You would have hit it on the way in. And we look forward to announcing and emailing the 2 lucky winners toward the end of today's conversations, 1 virtual attendee and 1 DC attendee. I've seen these gift baskets and I read our daily newsletters, and I promise that you'll be glad you signed up. Next up, we turn to sports, and more specifically, soccer, which also happens to be the sport of my adolescence. As a teenage right midfielder, I'm thrilled to welcome Jessica Berman, Commissioner of the National Women's Soccer League, who's going to be joining us from Westchester. Jessica has taken the reins at a pivotal time in the league's history. With so much on the line, we are looking forward to hearing about how she's approaching this period of healing and rebuilding in women's soccer. Nancy Armour, a national columnist for USA Today Sports, is here to lead today's conversation. I'd like to welcome Nancy to the stage.
All right. Jessica had some travel issues, so we're going to do this virtually. So could be kind of a work in progress. Let's see. Is Jessica there? Hi. How are you?
Hello. Hi, Nancy. Hi, everyone. I'm really sorry that I'm not there in person.
No worries. Let's jump right in, and we'll tackle the hard stuff right away. You have been the NWSL commissioner since April, and you've come after what has been a pretty turbulent year in women's soccer. The NWSL and the NWSL Players Association are still conducting a league-wide and club-wide investigation after The Athletic and the Washington Post reported that players at both the Portland Thorns and the Washington Spirit had been subjected to sexual coercion, verbal and emotional abuse. There were 5 male coaches who left under abuse or misconduct allegations last year. I guess the first question is, where does that investigation stand? Because we're seeing things come out that it's obviously still ongoing. There was just, you all just made an announcement earlier this month, but where does that investigation stand, and how long do you expect it to continue?
Yeah, so of course, I came in on April 20th and spent some time getting up to speed on some of the historical challenges as well as the ongoing investigation. And yes, you are correct. It is still ongoing. It was put into place, and I think this is a really important consideration for everyone to know, that it was put in place really jointly with our Player Association, which was really planting the flag and putting a stake in the ground as to how we're going to approach these challenges moving forward, which is in a collaborative, cooperative, joint effort with the union. And my background, as you may know, is that I'm a labor lawyer. And so I really value the role of the union in being an advocate for player interests and really helping them to understand some of our opportunities and challenges and vice versa. So I think that's an important consideration because I think it plays into the thoroughness and the substantive work that we're collectively doing. But as importantly, when there are more stakeholders at the table, sometimes it might take a little bit more time to get to the end result and to the finish line. And we're comfortable with that because we'd rather do this the right way and have our essentially clean bill of health moving forward, because the scope of the investigation is quite broad. It's really anything related to workplace misconduct, harassment, retaliation, both historical as well as through the present. And so it really is a wholesale review of the league's culture and culture challenges and issues. And we expect that there will be recommendations that we collectively work on with the union. And that's why I think it's really important that we're doing this in a collaborative, cooperative manner.
Most of what occurred before you took over, obviously. Your background has also been with male leagues. You were the deputy commissioner for the National Lacrosse League for almost 3 years before you came to the NWSL. Prior to that, you'd worked in the NHL for almost 13 years, I believe. How did you get players to trust you, or is that still a work in progress? And how do you promise them, or how do you get them to buy into the fact that this won't continue to happen going forward?
Well, it starts with authenticity and really coming to the table with an approach of wanting to listen and learn. And that is really truly my authentic self in any event. So it's not really a heavy lift for me to approach my role in that matter. And I've spent much of the last 6 to 8 weeks on a listening tour, including with individual players on teams, both current and former, to really understand and learn from their experience about how the league can improve, but also to understand the areas that they think the league has done well so that we make sure we continue to do those things. So really coming from a place of wanting to learn and learn from their experience. And I think that approach has really reset the relationship between the league and the perception of the commissioner's office and the players. I also think, again, credit to the board of governors and owners of our 12 teams, the process that they put in place to hire a commissioner uniquely, and I don't think this has ever happened in professional sports that I'm aware of, put the players in a position to be part of the interview process. So as part of my final rounds of interviews to be the commissioner, I actually met with groups of players, and their feedback and input was sought and valued by the board of governors. And I think, again, similar to the joint investigation, that really sets the tone for, of course, we are management and we're running a business, but really demonstrating to the players, most importantly, that we value their input, their perspective, their experience, and that we're going to actively seek that and provide them an opportunity to give us feedback.
As I mentioned, your experience has until now been with men's sports. What was it about the NWSL that appealed to you? And is there anything that you've learned over these last 6 to 8 weeks that you didn't expect but you've been pleasantly surprised by, or that make you even more excited about this job?
Yeah, I've been asked that question a bunch, and the best way to answer it is really that I work in sports and I've pursued a career in sports because of the proposition that sport has the power to change the world. I genuinely believe that sport has the power to change the world, and although I intended to be there with you in person, it's fortuitous that I'm in my home office, and you could probably see over my shoulder, I don't know if you can read it, but it's Nelson Mandela's quote that sport has the power to change the world. And that really is my guiding principle. It's the reason that I've pursued a career in this industry. Having grown up in Brooklyn, New York, which is really a melting pot of people from different backgrounds, I was always obsessed with the things in our social fabric that had the power to unite communities. And so all of that really frames my interest and desire to lean into this role and to this sport, because uniquely, I think most people would agree that NWSL has the ability to really transcend the sport ecosystem in how it can influence and impact communities, not just in our country, but globally. And to me, that's an undeniable opportunity and, frankly, responsibility. Some of the challenges that the NWSL has faced historically and most recently, I think I have the ability, based on my experience and my background, to actually support the league's growth and to help to address some of the systemic cultural issues that the league has faced. And again, given my background in labor relations and my approach to building consensus and stakeholder management, I really do believe, and did believe when I was offered the opportunity, that I had a responsibility to take this role, because I really feel like I can help move the league forward.
You mentioned growth, and I'd like to shift to that now, because we're really seeing a sea change when it comes to women's sports. You know, ratings have gone up, attendance has gone up, sponsors are wanting in, and you have owners that are finally saying, this isn't just a do-good effort, this is a really good investment, and we see that there's money to be made here. And you have a team like Angel City that is showing that you can make money here. So I'm wondering, what kinds of things have you been hearing, whether it's cities or groups that want an expansion franchise? I think you mentioned earlier, shortly after you took over, that you're seeing valuations anywhere between $35 and $100 million. And what kind of conversations are you having with sponsors that, in particular, that want to back women's sports? They don't want to just back sports, they want to back a women's league.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different circumstantial factors at play. The first is, I think, that we can't ignore the broader cultural relevance of the gender equity movement. And I know we're here today because we're having a Title IX summit. And so it's probably important to start the analysis with that point. And I think, as we know, anytime any movement or business can be at the intersection of something that's more broadly culturally relevant, it provides an opportunity for exponential growth. So we're fortunate that the country and the world has really begun to pay attention to equity, and in particular, gender equity, and businesses that really advance those issues and those narratives. And certainly, I think it's universally recognized that the NWSL, just when our players step out on the pitch, they represent that more broadly. So I think that's point one. I think point two is really not necessarily just because it's a women's sports league. I think what we're seeing in the sports industry and in the sports ecosystem right now is a desire to invest in challenger properties and growth properties, because you see the valuations that are happening in men's sports. And that's not to say that they're not going to continue to rise, but they're pretty high right now. And so the idea that there is incremental growth there, perhaps, and hopefully for all of those who are investing in those sports. But I think certainly as it relates to challenger properties more generally, and I just came from a challenger property, so this was part of the value proposition even when I was representing men's lacrosse players and a men's lacrosse league. The idea that our valuations are at a point where we describe it as the sort of hockey stick effect. We're at an inflection point of growth, and that appears to be apparent and undeniable to investors and to brands who are interested in growing with properties. And so I think those two things combined have really catalyzed and infused a level of enthusiasm as it relates to partnerships, both media and sponsors, as well as investors, that are going to really propel the league to its next chapter of growth, which I expect to be exponentially larger and better than it has been in the past.
It's a question I know that you get all the time is, what is the timeline for expansion? Who's getting new teams? So do you have a timeline for when you want to expand or a number of teams in mind? And how much have teams like Angel City and Kansas City, which is going to be the first team that's going to have a stadium built specifically for a women's team, that's not happened anywhere, how has that raised the bar? Or how has that changed in the conversations that you're having with groups or cities that want to get an expansion franchise?
Yeah, I think I'll answer the second question first, just because it's so exciting and it's actually happening. And I'm actually so pleased to say it's not only our expansion teams like Angel City and San Diego and some of our newer teams like Kansas City. We're seeing growth in all of our teams, and we have had record-setting attendance in our season beyond just the expansion teams. And so I think what we're seeing, and I think what Angel City has done so well as the investment that the Longs are making in Kansas City, they're showing the marketplace what is possible. What is possible when you invest real resources in a business that has historically been under-resourced. And when you invest in a business that's historically been under-resourced, you're going to see growth, particularly where the product, in this case, the game itself, is so compelling. And so I think we're starting to see more of that across the board. You're seeing investors being brought in many of our teams. I don't know if you saw, but Gotham recently announced new investors. We had Naomi Osaka invest in North Carolina. You're going to start to see, and there's a couple of other announcements to come in the upcoming weeks and months that are in the works, where you're seeing influencers and resources being infused into the business plan and the growth strategy for our teams that is, again, going to change the way the league is able to grow. As it relates to expansion and our timeline, I think it's our desire to certainly tap into the level of interest that we've seen waiting for us to be ready for an expansion conversation. We're in the process of choosing an investment bank right now who's going to represent us in that process, because the level of interest right now is so deep and wide that really we've made the decision that we need to invite some partners to the table to help us to manage that process and make sure that we're getting good advice on how to strategically leverage this opportunity to be able to expand the league.
There was just the announcement yesterday of the host cities for the 2026 Men's World Cup. We'll have the Women's World Cup is next summer. You'll have the men, and then in 2028 there's the Olympics in Los Angeles. How much of a opportunity is this, not just for the NWSL, but for soccer in the United States, to really piggyback off of those three events and build off those three events?
I think it's a massive opportunity. And we know that with almost no intentionality, the tailwinds coming off of Women's World Cups are strong. And we will intend to create intentional strategies pre and post to really invite those tailwinds into our league and ensure that everybody who's paying attention to the Women's World Cup next summer know that a lot of those players, the majority of those players, especially on the U.S. women's national team, actually play domestically right here in this country, which again, our product is so compelling that it is the fundamental ingredient to be able to grow the league.
You mentioned the tailwinds off of Women's World Cup, and your media rights contract is up after next season, which will be kind of fortuitous timing because it'll coincide right with the World Cup. Major League Soccer this week just announced a deal with Apple TV for $2.5 billion. That's billion with a B. So I'm wondering what your thought was when you saw or heard about this, and what do you think that portends for your negotiations for next year?
Yeah, well, we've been sort of waiting like everyone to see what that deal was going to be, knowing that all of those markers in the marketplace are data points that will help inform our media strategy and help inform the buyers for media rights as we enter the marketplace and begin to assess our value. So it was a huge data point for us, and I think it will be very helpful for us to really know and understand what their strategy is. And it's not just how much they're being paid, but their distribution strategy, the fact that every game is going to be able to be watched in one single place, and the clarity of that messaging, the idea that we have overlap with several teams in MLS and what this means for those particular teams. And so all of those things together certainly will be part of our landscape analysis, which is currently underway to help inform our process. But also the fact that, there's only so many media partners out there, and there's really not all that many contracts that are going to be negotiated between now and when we are going to be in the marketplace. And so we're at a point right now where we can really dig into the valuations that have occurred in sort of recent months and years, look at our ecosystem and really begin to inform what is best for the NWSL. And I should also mention that CBS, who's our current partner, have been unbelievable partners to us. And I'll give a plug for our game on Sunday that's going to be on CBS, which we're always excited when we're able to be on broadcast television. It really helps to be able to introduce the game to our casual fans and to potential new fans.
The NWSL reached its first ever collective bargaining agreement earlier this year. Obviously, the U.S. women just reached a collective bargaining agreement with U.S. Soccer that gives them equal pay for the first time ever in pretty much anywhere in sport too. How much does it help the fact that you have labor peace, not just with the NWSL, but with U.S. Soccer, that you don't have to be fighting that as you're trying to build growth?
Yeah, I think just the overall stability that is living now across not just the U.S. women's national team, but in our league is really a helpful foundation for me to be able to come in and rebuild the trust and credibility and relationship between the league and the players, which is some of what we were talking about at the beginning. And so from my perspective, quite ironic for me as a labor lawyer to come in when the deal's already done. I'm usually the one who's actually negotiating the deal. So to be handed a fully negotiated agreement and be able to just sign it, like it's actually my name on the signature line, but I had really almost nothing to do with negotiating the agreement, was definitely a role reversal for me. But I do think that it really helps to create the clarity that's required for the players and the teams in the league as to what everyone's rights and obligations are as it relates to players' terms and conditions of employment, which is really the key to unlocking the players' trust that they're being treated fairly, because there's a contract that says what is and isn't required.
We have time for one more question. Fast forward 10 years. What would you like the NWSL to look like?
Well, there's of course the obvious, externally speaking, more relevance, more revenue, more teams, more distribution, more partners, all of those things. But I would say as importantly, or maybe even more importantly, going back to the theme of your first hard-hitting question, Nancy, really that our internal stakeholders have the confidence and trust in the league that we're doing the right thing by our players and in our relationships with our teams, that we're professional and here really to support the growth of the league and have a value proposition to our internal stakeholders that is trusted. I don't know how to measure that, but I'm sure there's some analytics data person who could tell me what the metrics are to what kind of KPIs we can set up to determine that basically the league's getting the benefit of the doubt from our internal stakeholders and have trust and faith that we're here to do the right thing. I know that's going to take some time and some hard work in terms of relationship building, but that to me is probably the most important thing that we could do in the short term.
All right. Thank you very much, Jessica Berman, NWSL Commissioner.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you so much, Jessica. I am learning a lot today, and I know you all in the audience are too. And if you are tweeting, we hope you will do so using the hashtag 19th Represents. Lots of folks following along virtually as well. Title IX was designed to protect students from discrimination on the basis of sex, which includes sexual orientation and gender identity. And yet, transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming athletes are being targeted and excluded from school activities. Discussing this today with us are Katie Barnes, a features writer at ESPN who covers culture, LGBTQ issues, and sports, and Maya Suthia Reddy, a former professional golfer and founder of the Queer Asian Social Club. Kate Sossin, LGBTQ+ reporter at the 19th, will moderate this conversation. We'd like to welcome these folks to the stage.
Well, hello. I'm just throwing things all over the place. I know, yeah. Thank you so much for being here. This is so exciting. We have two incredible panelists. I'm Kate Sossin. I'm the LGBTQ+ reporter at the 19th. We've got Maya Reddy here, Katie Barnes, two incredible panelists with us, and I'm so excited for this conversation because it is such a trying moment for LGBTQ+ people, particularly in sports, and we're going to talk about the promise of Title IX, and we're also going to talk about where it's supposed to support LGBTQ people and what are some of the shortcomings. And I'm really excited because Maya has reached the highest level in athletics, a professional golfer, and then left. And I want to talk about that story. And Katie here is, I think, one of the best trans sports reporters in the country. And I think when you talk about...
so many of us. So many of us.
There's very few. But also just one of the best trans reporters in the country. And when you think about this issue, you think about Katie Barnes. And I really just want to talk to both of you because I'm curious, and I want to start with you, Katie. When you were starting out doing this work, if you imagined yourself being a person who wrote about gender, wrote about LGBTQ issues, or if you just wanted to write about sports and how that happened?
I think I've always been interested in writing about queer people in sports, for sure, and writing about gender in sports. You know, I love women's sports. That's what I've done my entire career and what I hope to continue to do. Whether or not I thought I would develop the very specific specialty of policy as it affects transgender athletes in sports, I did not expect that. When I published my first piece, which was in May of 2018, I'd spent about 2 years reporting it in different ways. And I thought I was going to publish that and then move on and maybe talk about it again, but not be writing another piece that published in 2020, and then another piece in 2021, and then Leah Thomas, et cetera, to the point where I feel like it's kind of the bulk of my job. That part of it's been surprising.
And similarly with you, Maya, I'm wondering, can you just talk a little bit about your journey into golf and then out of golf, and if you imagined for yourself if you would be the queer South Asian athlete, and you're sort of repping for the community at this point, and what that has been like for you.
Yeah, so I started playing golf much like Tiger Woods, except this is the only thing we have in common, that we both started playing golf when we were 3. And I basically started playing sports because I was jealous of all of my like guy friends and my cousins who are like huge athletes. And I was like, I want to be just like you. And then I found golf. I was playing golf, tennis, and swimming, and I just decided I didn't want to run. And so in golf, you don't have to run. But it is immensely difficult in so many other ways. So yeah, I mean, it was kind of the least exciting story of how I got into it. And, you know, I just kept playing more competitively to do the, you know, extracurricular to get into college. Went to college, was playing on my team, and had like this really great atmosphere, and, you know, like, felt really included. We felt like a family, and I just got so much better. And was like a 3-time All-American. Didn't win any tournaments when I played professional, so I have to rest on those laurels of my All-American status. But yeah, I mean, I had a really horrible experience during my senior year with an abusive coach, and kind of had a hard time finding my way back into golf, but then felt really frustrated that that kind of had been taken away from me. So, of course, the natural next step is to play professionally and go to my boss at the time and be like, I'm so sorry, I'm gonna go play golf professionally as a 22-year-old. But yeah, you know, like I never thought, but a part of me did want to always play professionally. And it was an incredible experience. Like, it's so cool to be like, I played professionally. But also like really difficult. You know, I had the great fortune or misfortune of playing during the lead up to the 2016 election. So a lot of people on the golf course were even more emboldened to say not good things. And so I was hearing a lot of xenophobia, homophobia. This was, I believe that Caitlyn Jenner had recently come out at that time, and there were a lot of folks, coaches, people on the golf course that were not interacting with Caitlyn's story in a kind way. It was just wildly transphobic and homophobic. And, you know, was on the golf course hearing a lot of that, racism, hearing a lot of people wanting to vote for Trump, me being very confused because I was not and did not benefit at all from Trump being president. Then I started hearing tournament directors make homophobic jokes on the first tee. So I was like, oh, cool, like get to go tee off. And then, you know, before I hit my first shot of the tournament, I'm hearing, you know, a lot of these homophobic jokes. So kind of all of that coalesced, and I had to take a step back because of my mental, like it was just impossible. And was really angry and really hurt. And I was like, okay, I need to do something with this. And so I mean, like I'd been reading Katie's articles, and was like, okay, there's so many folks doing and talking about not just women's sports, but like all of these intersectional identities within sports. Like there is space out there. Athlete Ally has been doing this work immensely. And
can you just tell us what is Athlete Ally for people?
Yeah, so Athlete Ally is a nonprofit that focuses on queer LGBTQ inclusion in sports, and they provide a lot of educational tools, a lot of visibility. I know, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I know that they do provide training for the incoming class of NBA players. I think that's true. I'm sorry for fake information if that's not true.
Making fake news.
Yikes. But yeah, I mean, like the way I found them is because they have, at that time, a few of their ambassadors were Megan Rapinoe and Gus Kenworthy. And I was like, oh my God, look at these really visible queer athletes who are Olympians, who are unabashedly queer, who are also using their platform to kind of push the conversations forward. And I was like, I really want to do that. Like, I don't have a platform. I don't have a platform compared to them. And I was like, okay, but nobody's talking about this in golf. So if one person just starts talking about this in golf, then like maybe that will make a difference, or maybe, at least for myself, I can tell my younger self that somebody is talking about this. So yeah, I channeled a lot of that anger into wanting to just, I don't know, make my younger self feel proud and know that, like, for my kids, there will be like a better space for them to go play golf, play any sport that they want, and chaotically chose to go to law school, and now I'm here.
Well, and I really want to get into this question about what are sports. And I know that seems like a silly question, and for someone who doesn't know a ton about sports, it seems even sillier to ask. But we talk so much about who should get to play sports and how, especially when we talk about trans kids. But I want to ask both of you, Katie is someone who covers professional sports. Maya is someone who has played sports at every level. And Katie, I know you've grown up playing sports. The question that I have is, as a nation, why do we play sports? Why do we love sports? And what are our priorities when we play sports, and what should they be? And how should that dictate who should get to play?
Small questions.
Yeah, no, I think because I think that maybe gets at the heart of trans inclusion,
Well, I think what you're touching on is that we have different levels of sports and varying experiences within those levels, right? And so, the answer to why we love sports, like sports is such an important part of our popular culture. From a consumption standpoint, as spectators, like, we love watching professional sports. That is, I think, separate from how a lot of us experience sports. And so, like, I think about my own upbringing. I grew up in a small town in Indiana. My first competitive sporting experience was at a Boys and Girls Club when I was 8 years old, because my parents had to drive 20 minutes to find a suitable amount of competition for me. The first time I could play sports competitively as a part of my school wasn't going to be until 6th grade. We played recreational soccer, town versus town. Like, so many of us have those experiences, and the majority of us, in terms of how we play and experience sports, do so on a recreational level for, like, our entire lives, whether we're talking about small kids or we're talking about how we play sports as adults. So much of those experiences are recreational, and I think it's important that we kind of start there. What has ended up happening is a couple of things. One is that we associate our experiences with sport with how we watch sport, and we watch elite professional sports. We're obsessed with them culturally. Which I love. It's my job to also be obsessed with them culturally. And so I'm not saying that is a poor response. But, watching Stephen Curry last night is very different than what we're talking about as far as how Title IX affects sports. And so simultaneously then, when we have this cultural connection to elite professional sport, when we talk about sports in different levels, we sort of project that, while also not recognizing that we have this sort of unique sporting apparatus, which is that where we have tied so much of the sporting experience for adolescence and early adulthood is to education. And so that creates a difficult conversation when we're talking about who gets to play sports, who should play sports, who does the law allow to play sports. And it's very convoluted because we're having these different conversations simultaneously with completely different understandings of what it is that we're talking about.
I think Katie put it like perfectly. We map on kind of like this professional sports, like the glamour, so to speak, of professional sports. And I think many of us are familiar with stories of like child prodigies. And I think that that creates an immense amount of pressure culturally to kind of like look at a child who's playing sports and be like, they could be the next Steph Curry, they could be the next Tiger. And, playing junior sports can be really toxic with that kind of mapped onto it. And I think that it takes us away from what the point of sports is. They're just a game. And I know for me, it's like the more fun I have, which I'm trying to relearn right now, the better I play. But at the end of the day, when you're a kid, you're not playing for money, right? Like, it's not a career. You're just going out to hang out with your friends. And when you see like policies targeting like K through 12 years old kids that are stricter than what the International Olympic Committee has or the NCAA, then it's like, I don't know, for me it feels like we're robbing kids of the chance to just be a kid and to go onto the field with like AYSO soccer and like pick up, not that I'm speaking from experience, but pick like daffodils or daisies on the field. Like, so I mean, like, I think that's exactly it. We take this like professional, this elite level, and we put it onto kids, and that just is really, really unfair and really toxic at the end of the day. Just leave aside kind of the Title IX implications.
So Title IX, of course, is the reason why we're here today. And I want to get into it a little bit. Can we talk just a bit, and Katie, I want you to kick us off here on how is Title IX relevant to LGBTQ plus people, athletes, and maybe what do we not understand about Title IX and LGBTQ people in sports?
Oh man, okay.
So this will take the next 20 minutes, which is what we got.
Sweet, I'll just run it all the way out. Okay. So I think when it comes to how Title IX affects LGBTQ people I'll start there. I mean, Title IX, I think oftentimes when we talk about it, it's sort of this catch-all shorthand for women in sports. And anything that has to do with women in sports is a Title IX issue. And that's not entirely true, right? And so to give you an example, like pay equity for the U.S. women's national team is not a Title IX issue in the sense that Title IX, really what it does is it protects all students in our schools from experiencing discrimination on the basis of sex. And that includes all activities, which is why it's often associated with sports. And so that before Title IX was passed, girls and women couldn't, if you were lucky, you got to play sports, but many could not. And under the law, suddenly schools had to provide sports opportunities for girls, and colleges had to provide sports opportunities for women. Now, stepping back from that, sex-based discrimination also includes LGBTQIA plus identities in different ways, not necessarily explicitly under Title IX case law, which you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in terms of Title VII employment law under Bostock, that has been established. And there's existing case law when it comes to like Pricewaterhouse v. Cooper, the various rulings from the EEOC, et cetera, that when we talk about sex-based discrimination, that does include LGBTQ people. Okay, so that's established. And then when it comes to sports, right, when we're having this conversation, going back to something I said earlier about how a lot of the times we're talking about LGBTQ people in sports or trans people in sports specifically, trans women and women's sports more specifically, we're sort of having these conversations about elite sport. But really where this fight has been had has been around Title IX. And so what I mean by that is, our current moment, I want to be clear, that for as long as there's been a women's sports category, there has been a desire to regulate that category. So that is not new. When we talk about this specific moment that we're in around transgender kids being able to access school and be affirmed in their identity in all aspects of school, whether we're talking about locker rooms, bathrooms, and or sports, that very much is tied to Title IX in terms of the Obama administration issuing a Dear Colleague letter in May of 2016, which really, I think, kind of launched this in response to that Dear Colleague letter, which essentially just said trans kids should also be able to be affirmed in schools under Title IX. Half the states in the country sued. And we've been in this back and forth ever since.
You brought us to something I think that is critical here, and I want to get both your opinions on this, which is that you said that for as long as Title IX has been around, right, it has been used to regulate women in sports.
Well, I actually said for as long as women's sports has been around.
Sorry, for women's sports.
Which
Sorry.
predates for Title IX, but yes.
Let me misquote you
It's
again.
fine. I just wanted to be clear.
There's also a racialized component to this a lot of times, which is that we've seen a lot of sex testing, right? And we've seen a lot of that happen, and we've also seen a lot of intersex athletes get snagged, right? Can you talk just a little bit about what that has looked like historically, and what are some of the consequences, not just for trans athletes, but intersex athletes and also just cisgender women in sports?
I was like, I'll go if you want. But
Maya, do you want to?
We just start finishing each other's sentences. That question really makes me think about many of the anti-trans sports bills that are happening, and I think specifically about Idaho's HB 500. And from my recollection, I believe that's still enjoined on the premise of it being facially unconstitutional.
It is.
Perfect, we love that. But essentially what HB 500 does is it allows any administrator who questions a student's identity, their gender identity, to subject them to genital verification or various other forms of invasive gender verification. And this is in order for those students to participate in sports. And so when you think about that, when you are suspecting a person to not adhere to what we think a woman is supposed to look like or what we think a man is supposed to look like, that's really rooted in this, Western European white supremacist idea of what femininity and masculinity are supposed to look like. So I know for myself, when I was a kid, playing golf, exploring my identity, I was wearing Abercrombie & Fitch cargo shorts, and really, really determined to take my bowl cut in Abercrombie & Fitch to the PGA Tour.
I just can't imagine. I just can't believe you admitted that publicly.
I have pictures.
I love that you admitted that
I'm going to send
publicly.
you a picture. I'll post it to the interwebs.
We're friends, it's fine.
But I think about myself then, and that was a huge kind of space for me to just figure out who I am, what my style is, right? What my gender identity is, even if I didn't have the words to say that then. But if HB 500 were in effect when I was a kid wearing those Abercrombie shorts, then it is undoubtable to me that my gender would have been in question, not just because of I had a bowl cut, but I was a brown kid, and I was one of the only, South Asian kids in my hometown, which if anybody wants to read about Reading, Megan Rapinoe has a really great description of it in her foreword. And I like to say that we're friends, even though we are not, and we're just from the same hometown. But I think that brings in this idea of how we are racializing femininity and masculinity, and particularly femininity, because, Katie, I think, can talk more about this, but when we look at Serena Williams, and the Williams sisters, entire careers have been really kind of marked by this conversation about how they appear more masculine, right? And how, I believe several years ago, a tennis commentator had remarked, or had commented on them being the Williams brothers because of, they are athletes. They look like badass athletes. Athletes are gonna have muscles. Sorry if that's offending men. But that's so much rooted in kind of how, different folks are presented. And when we think about kind of white supremacy or racism, right? If a brown person, a black person, seems threatening or threatening that structure because of our presentation of gender, then there is going to be this backlash to subjugate it. And we've seen that historically in so many different ways, with reproductive rights, with particularly black women in the South, and restrictions on ability to reproduce, marriage, et cetera. And so I think it's it's really impossible to take that sex stereotyping that's rooted in racialized identity out of this conversation, because it underlies so much of this policing of gender, this kind of sex verification. Who do we think is performing femininity appropriately within this kind of like patriarchal white supremacist structure?
Yeah, I was like, I don't know if I have much more to add, but I think when I think about it in the context of how women's sports functions, right, it's this idea that you have to prove that you are allowed to be in women's sports. And as I said, as long as women's sports has been a category, there have been efforts to police that category, often presented as a means of protecting the integrity of that category, which holds water in some respects, I think is fair to say. However, I think going back to what Maya said about how Idaho's HB 500 had an enforcement mechanism, there's an ongoing discussion about a possible bill in Ohio right now that has a very similar enforcement mechanism. The idea that if you are too good, if you don't conform in a specific way, then you can be questioned and then have to prove that you are allowed to play 8th grade soccer. And I think when we're having this discussion and we talk about sex verification, that has often been something that has been held at the elite level. And whether or not you agree with how invasive some of these procedures are, or just the level of scrutiny that we put athletes under at the elite level, we have globally accepted a higher level of scrutiny at the elite level, whether we're talking about Olympics or professional sports. That has traditionally not been something that has been part of our process in younger sports for, like I said, like 8th graders playing soccer, or 7-year-olds playing softball, or 15-year-olds playing tennis. Like, yes, obviously you go through your physical every year, but if you are showing up in this category and playing, the understanding is that you are allowed to be there. And so now it becomes a question of, and this is true for all athletes in women's sports, if you are too good, do then you have to prove that you're a woman? How do you do that? And when you have, I think, things showing up in bills explicitly enumerated as as the ways that you can prove that you deserve to be there, which is your chromosomes, your internal reproductive organs, your external genitalia, specifically showing up in legislation, that begs the question of, why are we doing that? And who is that going to affect? Because as we know, there is one transgender girl competing in Ohio. So if there's one of her, well, who's going to suffer the brunt of that policing effort? Mostly cisgender girls playing women's sports.
So this, I feel like we've asked this question, or maybe we haven't asked it enough. A lot of people, when I get on an airplane, which is often now, ask me this question of like, well, do you think that's fair? And I'm like, what? And my question always is, well, what would fairness look like? And I'm not talking about fairness for cisgender kids, because I feel like that's always the question that is posed to me, but what would fairness in sports look like? Like, what could the future of sports be? And I'm curious if we can talk through that a little bit, because I want to break that apart a little bit and think bigger about what is fairness just in general. And if you all have thoughts on what is fairness, and is that a concept that we want to think about? Maya, do you have thoughts on that?
I feel like I'm going to go into an existential crisis.
I know, we all are,
Just
because
like,
this is the question that everybody has, like, what is fair? Like,
I don't know if I have I don't know how I would describe fairness, but I do know that, as Katie was saying, like, the policing of who is and who isn't allowed to be in sports, that's categorically unfair. And like, we all play sports to have fun, and it's really cool when you get good at it. Like that, you can have more fun, you can, whatever it may be, but being good at sports shouldn't be an excuse to kind of like shut you out of sports. So I think for me, I think about fairness almost as the opposite of what people are trying to propose fairness is, like all of these BS fairness in women's sports acts, which are all kind of based on prove your ability to not just play the sport, but prove your identity as a woman. And you shouldn't have to prove your identity to be in any space. And I think, Katie mentioned PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is highly recommend folks read that case or a summary of that case, but it talks specifically about sex stereotyping in an employment context. And it's one of the bases for the Bostock decision, which also centers on sex stereotyping. And both of these cases, they talk about, in defending these trans and queer folks who are challenging discrimination, it's really showing what fairness could look like and what it isn't looking like right now in those contexts. So I think right now what I would say is no more sex stereotyping, because it's really cool to be any way that you are, is an ineloquent way of saying that.
Fairness. I think we like to think of sports as a meritocracy. And in many ways, it is. And also, nothing is fair about sports. It's not fair that Kevin Durant is like 7 feet tall and can dribble a ball like a guard and shoot really well. Like, I don't think anybody would say that that's fair, right? And I don't think anybody that played against him in high school would say that that was fair. And I'm not trying to make light of it. I think just in general, we have this feeling that I think what we want to have happen as a society is that when everybody steps up to the line, when everybody takes the field, when everybody takes the court, that there is an equal chance for every single person to win. And that has never been true about sports for a number of reasons. Some of it is the advantages that certain people have anatomically, physiologically, metabolically. Some of it is the advantages that schools have financially. Some of it is the advantages that individuals have financially. Is it fair that somebody, in a Southern California suburb can pay for a quarterback coach at age 12? And somebody who lives in Hartford, where I live, cannot. We have decided that that is fair enough. And so I think what is hard is, getting to the root of what fairness is supposed to mean. And so whether or not I have policy recommendations, as a journalist, I don't think that's my role. What I will say is that I think we as a society grasp for something that is not actually there in the way that we think that it is, or hope that it would be.
I think that is a great place for us to leave it. Katie Barnes.
It's just getting good, man.
I know, it was beautiful. Mayuri, I want to thank you both so much for being here. I'm deeply grateful to you both, and I'm grateful to you all for joining us today. Thank you so much.
I feel like that's a podcast I want to subscribe to. Alrighty. Thanks for such a powerful, insightful conversation. Before we get into our next panel, I'd like to welcome Grammy-nominated singer, songwriter, and mental health advocate Jewel for a moment of mindfulness.
So one of the other mindfulness tips I'd like to give is having you answer this one question. What do you want to get out of this experience? This experience is happening to us whether we like it or not. Nature is in control. We don't know how long it's going to last. What we can't control is what it does to us, how it changes us. And so if we can ask ourselves and use our creativity to ask a good question, like what do we want to get out of this experience, we're going to come out of this enriched. We won't waste this opportunity to let maybe old beliefs or old concepts or maybe old jobs or toxic people, to let them go. And to now say, what do I want to put in that place? What have I always wanted to learn that maybe I never thought I'd have the chance to learn? And the last thing I want to teach you is a simple gratitude hack. When you're really anxious, you're constricted. We need to figure out a way to help your whole system dilate. The easiest way is using gratitude. So anxiety, fear, worry, jealousy, greed contract us. Joy, gratitude, observation, curiosity, etc. dilate us. So if you're getting anxious and you're really heading into a severe anxiety attack, you have to really discipline your mind to become deeply grateful for something. And they've learned that your vascular system dilates, your blood pressure changes, neurotransmitters change. So I wrote a song about gratitude. This is called Grateful. It's out now, and I just wanted to release it during this time to give us all something to focus on that can be right around gratitude.
I'm going to have to Google it. Now we turn our attention to the gender pay gap. There is no doubt that Title IX has helped close the gender gap in higher education. We've seen that today women's enrollment and graduation rates significantly outpace those of men, but we have not seen the same progress extended to the gender pay gap. So joining us to dig into this issue are Sarah Jane Glynn, Senior Advisor of the Women's Bureau at the U.S. Department of Labor, Kate Bond, Chief Economist and Director of Labor Market Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and Yvonne Shu, Chief Policy and Government Affairs Officer at the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. The 19th's Jennifer Gerson is here to lead this conversation. Jennifer.
Well, thank you all so much for coming, and I'm so excited to talk with you three about this today. And I actually want to start with a question we got from one of our readers who said, this is Holly from Fort Worth, and she asked, what do I say to those who insist that the pay gap just doesn't exist and has nothing to do with gender? And I'd like to expand and say, and race. What do we know, and how do we start the buy-in component of this conversation? Kate, do you want to start with that?
Sorry. I'm revealing that I'm a Leo. I'm just going to jump into it. So, I mean, this is something that comes up a lot when I have these conversations, particularly sometimes people sort of have this idea that women are choosing it. And when we look at the reasons that explain the gender wage gap, that means it doesn't exist. I find that a little frustrating. It's like we do all this research, we try to look at the different components of what we think would help determine what someone is paid. And when we do that, we do find, we can explain why the gender wage gap exists. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So for example, we might say that women are in occupations that pay less than the occupations men are in. That isn't to say that the gender wage gap doesn't exist because women are segregated into lower paying occupations, or it might be that women have fewer years of work experience, and that helps sort of explain some of it. But because women have fewer years of work experience due to often caregiving responsibilities, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I still think when we look at that aggregate number of 20 cents less than men to the dollar, that still gives us a really good benchmark for the lower level of economic well-being that women experience. We can break it up and we can look at it. Sometimes within the same workplaces it reduces a lot, but the overall picture is women across the economy are not doing as well as men are.
And if I could just add a little bit to that, a couple of my colleagues did some research working with folks at the Census Bureau, and they found that even when you control for everything that Kate just mentioned, right, the types of jobs people have, their education, their years of experience, you still end up with the majority of that gap unexplained. So we can't actually put a pinpoint on why most of that gap is there. So there's a lot of questions about what's driving that. Part of it is probably discrimination. There might be other things in there as well. And even when we look at folks within the same jobs, in every detailed occupation that we've been able to look at, there is not a single one where women earn more than men. But there are a whole heck of a lot of them where men earn more than women, even within the same job. So there's very, very, very long, research projects looking at this. It is definitely there. We've got the data to prove that the wage gap is a real thing. The question is just now, what are we going to do about it? And I think that's where I hope the conversation goes, right? That we can stop arguing about whether or not this is a real thing and really start digging into some of the reasons behind it and what we can do to fix it.
So, to kind of take that further, what do we also know about how race starts to play into this, and what conversations do you think aren't always top of mind when we start to have this conversation about the fact that this is a very real reality and something that we still don't have a ton of kind of popular buy-in about?
When you look at the pandemic, women of color were hit the hardest by unemployment. And one of the things that I think very few people know is that Asian American women suffer from the longest unemployment rate during the pandemic of any racial group. And I think that's shocking because of the model minority myth about my community. But we're not all doctors, we're not all lawyers. We have, think about the restaurants that you go to and the Korean American or the Vietnamese American restaurant worker who is in that job because of language barriers, because of immigrant status. And so, I think we really need to, when we're looking at the wage gap and also at communities of color, we also need to think about all these additional intersecting identities that impact how much they make.
Yeah, Yvonne, I'm so glad you brought that up because I'd love to discuss that a little more too. When we talk about the wage gap, why is this a critical intersectional issue, and what does it mean to think about intersectionality when we're talking about the fact that there is a gender and race wage gap? And what other issues do people need to be talking about in this same conversation?
I mean, one thing I think is really important, and I think Yvonne's example brings up this point, that there is such a unique identity faced by these different intersectional groups of women, and we need to understand those unique experiences if we want to be able to design policies that can address the overall gender wage gap. If you look at the aggregate level, you miss a lot of why women have these different outcomes. So for example, there may be long-term unemployment is very high in the Asian American community, particularly in the pandemic. If we look at, the gender wage gap facing Black women, a lot of it is, a much larger portion is due to discrimination. A lot of it is also due to occupational segregation. There's particular jobs. For example, Black women are heavily overrepresented as nursing assistants, which is a very low-paid, very important, high-risk job in the pandemic. So we really need to understand what each of these different groups are experiencing if we want to be able to design policies that can get us to eliminate the overall gender wage gap.
Speaking of the pandemic, I'd also love to chat about what issues were kind of at play before the pandemic even happened in terms of where this gender and race wage gap exists. What happened during the pandemic? Who is disproportionately impacted? And are we even at a point today, 2-ish years out, where we can begin to assess where we are now and what has happened to these communities?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start, and then I'd love to hear from everyone else too. I feel like I'm a broken record on this, but I have been saying, and I know lots of other people have all along, like the pandemic didn't create any of these problems. It took everything that was already broken and made it even more so, right? So we know even in the best of times, for example, the unemployment rate for Black workers is roughly twice what it is for white workers. That's a long-standing issue that goes back as long as we've collected data. That's not a new thing, right? So it got much worse during the pandemic, but it's been a problem that needed to be addressed for a long time before that. thinking about occupational segregation and how that relates to Black women, the Department of Labor put out a report earlier this year where we estimated pre-pandemic, so before these really high levels of unemployment, that occupational segregation into particular low-paying jobs cost Black women almost $40 billion in lower wages per year. And for Latinas, it was almost $47 billion in lower wages relative to white men. So this isn't just like a small issue, right? This has implications for individual families, but also for the economy overall, because we're talking about such deep and systemic inequalities. And as we're starting to come out of the well, I don't want to say we're coming out of the pandemic because I don't want to say that it's over, but we're definitely entering a different phase, right? And we've been experiencing an economic recovery and a really dramatic and significant economic recovery. I don't want to underplay that, but it hasn't been even. So women of color have had a much slower recovery than white women have, right? And we need to be interrogating what those reasons are. And some of it is because of the industries that have rebounded and the types of jobs that folks have, and some of it is also because, frankly, we have systemic inequalities in this country that we still need to address. So, there's just such a rich conversation to be had here about what happened over the last couple years, but we need to keep in mind that these are problems that have been in place for a really long time. And so if we're going to actually address them, it's not just about ending this particular public health crisis, it's about addressing what those underlying vulnerabilities were even beforehand.
And I'd love to just follow up really quickly on that. What tools are in the toolbox? What can the Department of Labor, for example, do? What can we do to start changing some of these narratives and some of these systemic issues?
Yeah, I think if we're talking specifically about the types of jobs that women and women of color are likely to have, there's kind of two big things that need to happen. So one is that we need to recognize that the jobs where women are concentrated are really important jobs and they should be paid better. We need to raise the floor on those jobs, right? So things like the care economy, where we see childcare workers, 95% of them are women, about 40% are women of color. Those are really low-paid jobs that are incredibly important because the rest of our economy can't function if our children aren't cared for, right? So investments there and raising the floor on wages for those workers is really important. And we also need to help women get into non-traditional careers if that's something that they're interested in and that they have the skills for, right? And we need to help them build those skills when they have the interest. And so making investments in things like apprenticeships and helping women break into some of these spaces that have traditionally been closed off for them will go a really long way in helping to address some of these problems and inequalities that we've been dealing with for so long in our economy.
Kate and Yvonne, both, I'd love to hear you speak to something that this raises too, which is a question of paid leave and what kinds of jobs give people access to paid leave, what we know paid leave does for people's economic outcomes. What are we not doing and what are we not talking about? We had a great conversation before we came out here about how I was very grateful to be at a place where I had fantastic paid leave after just having a baby this year, and that was critical to my being able to do my job. What's not happening for most people?
First, congratulations on the baby. Having a baby during the pandemic is not easy. I experienced that myself, and I was also very fortunate to have paid leave. But when we're talking about the most vulnerable during the pandemic, these are folks who are on the frontline workforce who don't have access to paid leave. And these are folks who need it the most. And I think I want to even bring in a topical conversation about this infant formula shortage. And people are like, well, people should just breastfeed. Well, if you're working a frontline job, that's really not an option. And so I think people often forget that. These are really the most vulnerable workers, and they were hit the hardest, I think, going back to the pandemic. The pandemic hit those who are making less than $35,000 the hardest. It didn't impact people like me who had a desk job, who had access to paid leave, and these are people who are really at the most vulnerable communities. So I think, we do need better national paid leave, childcare. These are all things that will really support the families that need it most.
And I also, it's not just paid leave too. Like, paid leave is great. We should absolutely have paid leave. But when we think about the fact that caregiving is such an important factor in how women engage in the economy, the unpaid caregiving they do in their homes for their families, you need paid leave for, periods of time that might be more than a few weeks long. So after the birth of a child or a new child coming in the home. But then if your child gets sick or your partner gets sick or you need to pick up, take care of someone else, that is when you need paid sick time. And so you need paid sick time to do that. Or if you who need a flexible schedule in order to manage care responsibilities and being able to do your regular job. And so we really need all these policies to reinforce each other, because just being able to take time off after the birth of a child or with a major illness is not sufficient to actually help people manage sort of the complicated caregiving needs that people have in their lives. And when we also look at these types of workplace benefits, they're typically through workplaces, but sometimes through social insurance systems. It's that the lower paid jobs are those jobs that are less likely to have these benefits, and so we're intersecting lack of good benefits with pay. Sarah Jane has done research on this, so I would refer to her research looking at who has access, and it is, the same exact women who are earning less money are also the ones who don't have access to things like paid leave and paid sick time, flexible scheduling that they have control over, and factors like that.
So I feel another topical conversation right now is there's a big conversation to be had about the future of reproductive health care, and really holistically reproductive health care, from contraception to abortion access. What do we already know about how all these things factor into, again, people's economic outcomes, and knowing that we're already in a formula shortage, we're already coming out of a pandemic, and that we are waiting to get a Dobbs ruling? What things are you thinking about in terms of what's at stake for people's economic security and economic mobility right now?
It's frightening. A lot of the work that we do is focused on reproductive justice, so thinking about access to reproductive care from an intersectional lens. And I really can't, it's so hard for me to picture what it's like for someone who needs to seek care, especially someone living in the South, someone who is low income, someone who may not be able to travel out of state because of financial reasons, maybe because they have to take care of children. They can't leave their kids at home. Maybe they can't travel out of state because of their immigration status due to checkpoints. And these barriers already exist. And so for the most vulnerable, they're not able, the right to abortion has not guaranteed access. So if Roe falls, it's going to be extremely frightening. And I can't even, I think just from a personal standpoint, not even getting into the economic standpoint, I know we're here to talk about the wage gap, but I'd love, I think, it's frightening, and I'll just pause there.
I mean, we have economics research that can really add to the frightening picture that you described, that really emphasizes exactly what this is like for women. There are direct costs, and that would be things like if you need to take time off to travel, you may not have access to that time off, or if the cost of services is just very high, you may not be able to access that cost. Having an unintended pregnancy comes with a whole other host of costs. But in addition to that, there are indirect costs. So there's research that shows that women just plan for their lives differently when they don't have control of their own bodies. Women are less likely to enter and complete education. They're less likely to go on to graduate degrees. They're less likely to have, future careers as doctors and lawyers. We have research that looks at these exact things. And one sort of specific one that I've looked at is looking at targeted restrictions of abortion providers now, so trap laws like the Texas Whole Women's Health case, where essentially, they're designed just to target and close abortion clinics. They're not necessarily medically justifiable laws, and women who live in those states that have these real major attacks on the ability to access abortion care, they are less likely to go into higher paid occupations year over year. They're less likely to be able to transition from unemployment into employment. And so when we're thinking of the gender wage gap, we know occupations play a big role. And so if we're just stacking it against women who are already facing these barriers and trying to get into better paying jobs, and we're making it even harder for them to do so.
I think another thing a lot of people are thinking about is, depending on what we see with Dobbs, what other things we might see. And I know another conversation I feel like a lot of folks are having is about contraception too. And what do we know about contraception and how that plays into all these same things we're talking about? Why is this really an intersectional economic issue when we're talking about access to contraception?
One quick point I'll make is that so much like the kind of policies you need for caregiving, I think reproductive health care is really sort of multifaceted and reinforcing. And so there's research that shows, in particular, it is not only having access to contraception, but contraception and abortion care is really critical, because with contraception care, with having contraception, it might affect how you plan to go into college, but in order to complete college, you also need to be able to get access to an abortion if you need one. So you really need the two things to ensure that you have control over your bodily autonomy. It cannot be just one or the other.
I will just add to that. I've recently heard the analogy, with COVID, there's the Swiss cheese approach, right? Masks don't do everything, vaccines don't do everything. You can't vaccinate everybody, but a bunch of preventative measures layered together creates the Swiss cheese effect. And I think this is where we're headed for reproductive care. Contraception, hopefully in the next couple years, will be even more widely available. There's a FDA process that will begin soon that will make birth control available over the counter. This is one of the solutions, medication abortion, which we haven't really touched on. And I think having reproductive freedom gives women the autonomy to build the life that they want to build their careers, have economic freedom. I think it's all tied together.
So, on that note, what would you all like to see happen in your fantasy economist brain lives? What should be happening in terms of all of these things that we're talking about? What are some of the steps that could go into effect that could change economic outcomes and close this gender and race wage gap? We can go down the line, I think, because I'd love to hear you all talk about this and what you envision for what this future could look like.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I think there's two ways I would think about it. Part of it is that we do already have laws in place that address some of these things, but unfortunately they aren't all or have not always been well enforced, right? So gender discrimination, racial discrimination, discrimination based on ethnicity or country of origin, those things are already illegal when it comes to setting pay or making hiring and promotion decisions, right? That's why we have things like the EEOC. And so making sure that these laws that are on the books are being well enforced, right? We're here to talk about Title IX. That's the context of all of this, right? We do have a long legacy of these laws in the United States. And so making sure that they are protected and enforced is really important. And putting resources behind that is really important. And then moving forward, there are still barriers that we need to break down. And I think for me, a lot of my work does focus on this issue of occupational segregation. And so thinking really critically about investments that are being made right now through things like the bipartisan infrastructure law, for example. There's a lot of money that's going out to states right now around built infrastructure. There's going to be a lot of jobs that are created out of that. And so at the Department of Labor, we've created the Good Jobs Initiative to really be working with folks to make sure that those jobs that are being created are good jobs that pay a sustainable living wage, and making sure that those jobs are not just available to the folks who have typically held those jobs in the past, but opening them up so that women and more people of color can also be benefiting from these investments that we're making. So it's both about, making sure that the protections we have already stay strong and that we continue to enforce them to the, most effective ability that we can, but then also being forward thinking about where are these barriers and how can we continue to break them down as we move forward.
That's a good question. I think similar to what Sarah Jane brought up is that there's things that we already kind of know what to do and there's laws around those things, but we could bolster those. And so two policies that we haven't touched on yet, but we know are really effective, particularly for women, are minimum wages and unions. And so these are things that do exist already, but they are greatly weakened. So how do we increase the ability of people to organize their workplaces, protect them against retaliation from employers? How do we raise the minimum wage so it keeps up with inflation and is enforced? That's another big problem, is that a lot of times employers do not actually pay the statutory minimum wage. They just break the law and essentially steal the money that their workers are owed. And so those are two big bodies in the workplace that I think would help. I also think on the other side, just raising the sort of universal outside option for workers. And so that would be things like making sure that everyone's lives are better, also gives them power in the workplace because they don't have to accept bad jobs and live paycheck to paycheck if they have access to adequate unemployment insurance, if they have universal health care, if they don't have huge debt burdens from student loans and things like that. So improving their outside conditions will also give them more power in the workplace to demand higher wages.
Plus one to what Kate and FJ said. I'm going to go with a little bit of in a different direction here. You know, I think the fight that we do at NALPOF is really focused on dispelling the model minority myth, because the model minority myth really invisibilizes those who are most impacted. So the folks that we're really talking about and focusing on here today. Even within our own community, there are huge disparities with the wage gap. Certain ethnic groups make $1.18 to the white male dollar. And yet there are certain ethnic groups that make under 50 cents. That's a huge range. And when you aggregate us together and average us, the Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander wage gap averages at 75 cents to the dollar. So when you lump us and speak about us as one community, it really invisibilizes those who are most impacted. So one thing I think really is just having better data, disaggregated data to tell this story.
Just to kind of bring this back full circle to how we started, we had that question from one of our readers and viewers asking about, what do you say to people who don't believe this? What do you say to lawmakers, to taxpayers, about why there should be buy-in on this issue and on some of the things you all just discussed? How do we have this conversation about why this impacts all of our communities when we talk about the gender and race wage gap? So again, let's just go down the line because we're having a great time here.
Well, I mean, I tried to nod to this earlier too, but I think it's easy to think about this as an individual level problem, right? How am I being paid relative to my coworkers? What does this mean for my bank account? What does this mean for my family? And that is a really important aspect of this, right? Individual people are suffering and we should care about that deeply, but there are larger macroeconomic impacts as well, and I'm sure Kate will happily speak to this as well. But like, we should care about how our neighbors are doing because it does impact all of us, right? If there's one thing I would hope that we have taken away from the last couple of years, it's that we are not each little individual islands. What happens to you impacts me and vice versa, right? So if we want to have a strong, vibrant, growing economy, we need to lift everybody up, right? Inequality is not actually good for the economy, as it turns out, right? We could all be doing better if we were all doing better. And that can sound like sort of a silly soundbite, but it is true. There's a lot of data to back that up. So even if you don't see yourself personally reflected in some of these fights, it's still impacting you one way or another because we all still live in the same country and we're all still part of the same economy. So you should buy into it because it's touching your life whether you realize it or not.
Yeah, second to that, and if anything, I do think actually that like you should care about your neighbor argument is maybe one of the strongest tools we have is just to get people to have more empathy. In absence of people having empathy, there is an economic case to make. And so the organization I work for, Equitable Growth, this is the whole premise. My organization believes that when we look at the wide body of economics research, economic inequality distorts growth, it obstructs growth, it prevents growth. What we're seeing when women are not in jobs, cannot get access to every job that they would love to do, it is a misallocation of talent that harms the whole economy. Our economy is unproductive if people aren't able to match into good jobs, if they aren't able to earn enough money that they would then be consumers and spend in the economy and boost aggregate demand. It's all these spillover effects from having a dynamic economy that we are missing out on by holding back women.
I think we should all care because women carried us through the pandemic. Women were the ones who were the first to quit their jobs to take care of children. Women had to stay home. Women had to take care of elderly parents. Women continued to show up to their frontline jobs during the peak of the pandemic. So we should care because we're the ones who carry us through.
Thank you all so much for coming today. I think it's just been a fantastic conversation. It's been an honor and a pleasure to chat with you all about this, and so excited to see what can come out of all of this and these next steps. So thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much. That was a really illuminating conversation. Thank you, Jennifer, for moderating, and great to have you all here. Next, I'm excited to share a performance with 10-time Grammy-nominated singer-songwriter Brandy Clark. In just a moment here, she'll be performing the song Who You Thought I Was.
Used to wanna be a cowboy, a shadow in the sunset. That's why I started smoking cigarettes. Used to wanna be a cowboy, used to wanna be Elvis, drive a pink Cadillac car. That's why I learned to play the guitar. Used to wanna be Elvis. There's a lot of things I used to wanna do till I met you. Now I wanna be honest. Now I wanna be better. Now I wanna be the me you should have been when we were together. I wanna be at least almost close to with your love. I wanna be who you thought I was. Used to wanna join the circus, hang around with the freak show. Wish I learned to walk a tightrope. Used to wanna join the circus, used to wanna stay 18. Used to want an Airstream with a lawn chair, tumbleweed view. Now I just want you. And I wanna be honest. Now I wanna be better. I wanna be the me I should have been when we were together. I wanna be at least almost close to worth your love. I wanna be who you thought I was. There's a lot of things I used to wanna be till you stopped loving me. Now I wanna be steady. I wanna be forever. Now I wanna be the me I could have been when we were together. I wanna be at least almost close to worth your love. I wanna be who you thought I was. Yeah, I wanna be who you thought I was.
Hello, everyone. How are we doing today? Good. Thanks for that excitement there. My name's Juana Summers, and I am the incoming host of NPR's All Things Considered. I am super excited to be here with all of you and really proud to be a member of the 19th. I have been hearing so many great things about all of the community and conversations you've been having. And I'm super excited because I get to talk with the founding mothers of this wonderful organization. Now, you've already been hearing from Emily Ramshaw and Amanda Zamora a little bit, but I want to introduce you to our other new friends over here. My dear friend Erin Haynes is the 19th's editor-at-large. And Johanna Durlega is the Chief Revenue Officer for the 19th. Now, I don't have a lot of time with these folks, and we have a lot to talk about, so I just want to jump right into it. I have been hearing so much about the 19th from before the site was even born, from my conversations with Emily and with Aaron, and I have just known that this was something that we need in journalism, something that I need as an audience member. So I'm excited to bring you into some of the conversations I have been having with them. And y'all, I just want to start out with a little bit of a rapid fire question to begin. If you can believe it, the site has only been around for about 2.5 years, which feels crazy to me.
To us.
So maybe a little rapid fire here. Let's start. If you can think back to those early conversations 2.5 years ago, maybe in 2 or 3 words, what kind of qualities were you hoping that the 19th would bring to journalism? And Emily, you've got the mic in your hand, so I got to start with you.
I was just thinking back probably to the days when I was like hitting you up trying to hire you. There's still time. Let's see. I thought about equity, I thought about opportunity, and I thought about representation. Those are my rapid fire 3.
Yeah. I thought about empathy, nuance, and subversive.
Ooh, I like that one.
I thought it was time to change the narrative, and I thought that it was an idea that was very urgent, but also very overdue. I couldn't believe that nobody had ever thought of this before, but I was so glad that you two did.
Aaron never speaks in 3 words.
Not possible.
Audience focused and representation.
So, Johanna, you mentioned representation, and that's the next thing I kind of want to talk about. One of the best things about watching the 19th grow is the fact that y'all have hired a lot of my favorite people working in this business, and the diversity of your staff, whether it is the people who are creating the journalism or all throughout the organization. And that is something that has clearly been an intentional part of growing this team. And so I wonder if y'all can talk a little bit about why that matters and how it affects the work that you do every day.
I'll just quickly say, it is not about the headlines per se, although that's the most obvious, representation of the way that we think about political journalism that centers women and people of color and LGBTQ plus folks. But in order to get those headlines, it's also about the team and the culture and the way we go about doing the work. And so I think that has been baked into the foundation of the 19th and our mission, but also as every new person comes on board, being open to their lived experience, creating the kind of space that empowers people's points of view and their voices, even when they are at odds, kind of embracing that tension. That is the creative tension that I think this industry that all of us need in order to kind of break through a lot of dysfunction in legacy media and in other spaces to create something new and better. I don't think that kind of growth doesn't come without building that diverse team, but also being open to that growth, which sometimes, growth is painful sometimes. And I think that we've seen that through the pandemic, and we're committed to that process.
I think from the very beginning of my conversations with Emily and Amanda, knowing that equity was going to be at the core of who we were going to be as a newsroom, not knowing necessarily how we were going to get there, not knowing necessarily what that was going to mean, but knowing that was what was wrong with political journalism. Frankly, it's been too white and too male for too long. It remains that way. And the fastest way we felt like for it to be different was for us to start over. And so, that is what we did. People talk a lot, as Amanda mentioned, about, bringing your lived experience to work. But I think that is something 2 years plus into this, we are really walking the talk on that. And you don't get the kind of coverage that you see us putting out every single day without a diverse set of lived experiences that not only do we value as colleagues, but I think really helps our audiences appreciate the voices that we bring into this democracy that have previously just been unseen and unheard.
You know, one of the things that has impressed me about what you all have done is that this is clearly an organization that knows how to pivot. We should just acknowledge the fact that you launched at the beginning of a pandemic where we all went into our homes. You did not meet most of your colleagues and the folks that you work with for some time, which I have to imagine took some pivoting, but it's also about the types of ways in which you talk about what you do and the types of people that you're inclusive of. One of the things that I noticed as an outsider is the ways in which you changed your mission some in order to include a diversity of marginalized genders, not exclusively women. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what that process was like, some of the ways in which you had conversations both inside your newsroom and outside that led you to that point.
I'm happy to kick off with that. I mean, I think, look, the vision for the 19th in the early days was not the most inclusive vision, honestly. I mean, it was, in many ways, it was like me in the middle of the night thinking we needed a news organization that centered women. And then working with Amanda, it became, far more expansive to thinking about the intersectionality and thinking about who we are aiming to serve. And, could we specifically aim to serve an audience that included more women of color? And then in the early days of our staff, first of all, I credit a lot of this to our extraordinary staff and the people who were very collaborative on our team in helping us think about what a more expansive future for this organization could look like. And the reality was that women are not the only people marginalized by their gender, right? And so for us to be able to say and to sort of draw our line in the sand and say that we don't just serve women, we serve anybody who is pushed down by the power of the patriarchy, and that includes trans people, that includes non-binary people, that includes the LGBTQ community writ large. That was a big and critical pivot for us, and I think something that honestly wasn't just the right thing for the 19th, it was the right thing for this industry. And if you look at the extraordinary work we do that serves the LGBTQ community, I think it is second to none. The other big pivot we made was around January 6th, and when the founding mothers got together and basically said, you know what, our original mission statement said that the 19th is not just nonprofit, it is nonpartisan, and we felt like the terminology nonpartisan really had been sort of co-opted to mean both sidesism, and we weren't gonna play that game, There were truths and there were lies after January 6th, and the 19th drew a line in the sand, said, there are things we're not afraid to stand for. We think it's okay for a newsroom to stand for gender equity and racial equity and human rights, and also for facts and truth and science and evidence. And we're going to say now that we are firmly an independent newsroom, and we mean that that's a lowercase I, not a political affiliation, but for us it means we retain the right to full independence as a newsroom.
I want to stay with that for a second. All of us have worked in legacy newsrooms before, where the idea of declaring that independence, of shedding that label of nonpartisan, I think we use as a crutch far too frequently. Was that uncomfortable for you, for any of you? What was that like?
For me, for sure. I spent my entire career in Beltway Media, and everything is nonpartisan. I mean, if you want to succeed fiscally, financially, you're nonpartisan. So it was an adjustment. It's still an adjustment for me. But I see such value in it right now, and I think the fact that we do stand for something so important is what really carries us through. And as we think about our financial future, right? Especially if we're thinking about corporate and advertising and sponsorships, that this is something that's going to take education and why we stand for what we do and why it's so important for us to do it.
Yeah, and I think that, what I would add to that is, what we stand for is democracy. We are a newsroom that is named for an amendment around voting. So, to both sides, something like the issue of voting rights and protecting people's access to the ballot, no matter who they are, that is something that, I'm not going to be objective about, right? And would not want other folks to be objective about. But listen, at the end of the day, what we are doing really, I think, hews to the core tenets of what we do in this profession. We are really trying to leave behind the most honest and accurate record of who and where we are as a country, right? And that is the thing that we are focused on. And so I think that our mission, the adjustments that we've made to our mission really more clearly reflect that goal for us as we try to do this work differently.
I want to move now to talking a little bit about the coverage moving forward, and I want to start with the pandemic. I don't want to suggest that the pandemic is over. It is far from it, but we are moving into a new phase. We are on the horizon of some of the youngest members of our society being able to be vaccinated, thank goodness.
Hallelujah.
Amen to that. And One of the things I have loved is that you all have pointed out in your journalism over and over again how folks from marginalized backgrounds have been disproportionately affected across the board by this pandemic. I'd love for you all to talk a little bit about what we might see next in your coverage of the ongoing effects of this pandemic on the audience that you serve.
Well, we were just talking about the pay gap earlier today and also yesterday, and the fact of the matter is that we're not out of this pandemic yet, and haven't fully recovered in any which way, economically, physically, mentally, and here we are on the verge of a recession, and the folks who were set back now are going to be grappling yet again, behind where they started going into the pandemic. And I just think, again, as we heard earlier, the pandemic exposed a lot of inequity that has been, persistent yet ignored. And so now, we're talking about these issues. The 19th is committed to keeping, focusing on these communities and these issues, but what's next in terms of policy? It's just being persistent in our coverage to really maintain a focus and centering folks who are, not only struggling in the day-to-day, but like looking at the magnitude of the economic impact and what that amounts to in their day-to-day lives, and also what it amounts to in elections. We're covering politics, and a lot of these things do play out at the ballot box. And when voting rights are at issue, whether or not people are even getting the information that they need, we're living in layered on top of everything. We're living in this era of mis and disinformation that even just makes it so infinitely complicated to get people basic, accurate information that they would need to leverage in order to exercise their agency at the ballot box. So these issues are just so critical, and I think that they're only going to be more so. And so trying to do the best job that we can do to shine a light on those issues, but also make sure people have the information that they need to vote well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, look, what we know from our audiences is that they are continuing to navigate this pandemic. They are continuing to try to navigate this democracy, frankly, right? And what we are hearing from people, whether it is the experts that do this work for a living every day, or the experts who are the people that we are interviewing who are living this every single day, is that they're not going back, right? And so what I think so many of our journalists and what we are committed to doing as an organization is to really document that new normal. The ability that we've had, especially in this virtual environment, has really been incredible to me to create community where people, even in this isolated virtual environment, have felt seen, who don't feel as alone or as isolated, because these shared experiences that we have been able to amplify through our journalism are helping them to figure out these last 2 years. Like, we want to carry that forward, even as we are still in the midst of this pandemic, but as we emerge to whatever the new normal is going to be for all of us.
As I think about what types of stories are on the horizon, one of the big things I know that has been on a lot of our minds is the upcoming Supreme Court decision on abortion, which will affect the lives of millions of Americans. And I have to imagine there are a lot of people who are going to be turning to the 19th to help understand what that means for them, the politics, the lived impact. Can you talk a little bit about how this organization is preparing to meet that moment, no matter what happens in perhaps a few weeks even?
I mean, I would say this story for our organization is a full court press. When you get ready for a major national news event, in a lot of newsrooms, you have people from across departments who are touching these particular stories. For us, abortion is not just a reproductive health story. It's not just a gender and health story. It's an economic story. It's a higher education story. It's a public education story. It's an economic, the economic outcomes are obviously intense. It's a pay gap story, as we were talking about just a few minutes ago. I mean, when the news leaked several weeks ago, it was almost every reporter in our newsroom was engaged in this story in one way or another. And look, the really beautiful thing about working at a news organization like ours is people just, even though you're virtual, everybody just sort of like comes out of the woodwork and is throwing in, and it's trying to figure out their way into this story, their angle in this story. clearly a story that also deeply affects the LGBTQ community. And so for us, I think whether it was a couple of weeks ago or literally every day that there's, the Supreme Court decisions drop and everybody's sitting on Slack, like watching SCOTUS blog refresh and refresh and refresh. This is, I would say this is probably like the story of my lifetime. I think many of us are operating in spaces where I live in Texas. Amanda and I live in Texas. I'm in a state where my daughter has fewer rights than my mother did. And it is pretty extraordinary to be living through this time. I hate to say that the 19th was made for this moment because that's cliche, but thank God the 19th exists for this story.
Johanna, can we talk about money?
Please.
Yes, my favorite topic. The 19th obviously exists because of the support of members, but also corporate sponsorships, philanthropy. What are you looking at on the horizon in terms of what sustains the important work that you all are doing? Do you see any changes to that? What's exciting you right now?
Well, I'm so grateful that we're a diversified nonprofit model. There's no way we probably would have survived trying to launch in a pandemic if we were a straight for-profit news organization relying on corporate sponsorships and advertising. So that excites me moving forward because things ebb and flow. And so we do have a lot of different areas where we can, look at where is the growth, where should we dig in. Looking, on the horizon, we're seeing a lot of continued major donor support and interest. Our coverage is second to none. Our LGBTQ plus coverage is groundbreaking, and a lot of people have taken notice, and certainly right now with reproductive rights, we're seeing a lot of interest from foundations as well as major donors. In terms of corporate sponsorships and advertising, that's been tougher. Last year was a better year. We had a little blip and it was really exciting, but there's a lot of fear right now. The globe is in chaos. But what we're really looking to do is, what new opportunities can we offer? And we've got some things in the works that we'll be unveiling in terms of really aligning with organizations that share in our mission of equity and representation, and approaching those organizations and working more deeply with them, and really approaching them as a nonprofit rather than just a news organization. I think that's something that's really differentiated. We've really been going after them as just straight advertisers, and we are a nonprofit, and so we're kind of working through some opportunities there. So I'm really excited because, again, there are so many levers that we can pull, and it's new to me. I was always in for-profit media, so stay tuned.
Stay tuned. All right, well, that is exciting. I want to talk to you about one other coverage area that is near to my heart. I happen to think it's one of the most important stories to tell, and that's the story of climate change. And I love that you have devoted someone to covering the intersection of gender and climate. I think it's so smart. Can you talk about why that is such an important role to invest in early in the company's existence, how you see that story evolving?
Yeah, look, shout out to Jessica Cutts, our climate reporter. Please follow Jessica if you are not already doing that. Environmental justice is an issue for this democracy. It is gendered. We are absolutely learning that through Jessica's amazing coverage just in the short time that she's already been with us. Literally a story Jessica has on our site today about, tips for pregnant people in, everybody's talking about how hot it is right now. Like, that is an issue. If you are a pregnant person right now, you definitely know how hot it is, right? So, no, but whether it's the first responders in a natural disaster who are having to deal with the gendered aspect of that, I just feel like I was so glad that we were able to add that beat as a priority topic for us, because I think that, as a newsroom, we thought that climate and gender were important, but really having that affirmed through the coverage has been deeply gratifying to see, and not just from a newsroom standpoint, but also in terms of our audience saying that this is really coverage that resonates with them, and they're able to start thinking about climate in different ways because of the coverage that we are doing.
I mean, there's a gender angle for almost everything. And when we first told people we were starting the 19th, we had a lot of people say to us, like, so like, what, you're going to run out of things to write about. There's not enough to write about. And in virtually every vertical, there are so many critical stories where you see women and queer people are disproportionately affected or negatively affected or affected in an outsized way. And I think, yeah, climate is one of those examples, but there are so many, whether it's military, whether it's criminal justice, the list goes on and on.
I want to talk about, Erin, you mentioned earlier the fact that even though we have all been spread apart, we've been unable to gather in person. I know this, at least for me, this is my first in-person event in a very long time. But you all have managed to create community around the work that you do, even virtually. Can you talk a little bit about how you've been able to do that and what makes the community that you all have built different?
Yes. So first of all, let me just say I want to piggyback on what Johanna was saying about the support that we have gotten. One thing that has been very surprising but also deeply affirming and gratifying has been the support of our members. Those of you who are out there in the audience, those of you who are watching right now, I'm going to get emotional. Thanks, Juana.
Sorry.
But, I mean, you know, for people who have given as little as $19, as little as $5, whatever you have been able to give to support this organization, I cannot say how much it means to us that you all continue to do that. It just really resonates with us that you think that we should exist in the world. I mean, here we were, the four of us thinking that we maybe had a good idea, but not really knowing if that was going to be true or not. And then we launched in January of 2020, and so many of you have just shown up for us again and again. The virtual events that we've been able to put on before we were able to be here in person with you all for the first time this year, that so many of you have been in a room with us on a Zoom screen for as many Zoom screens as you have to be on, that you wanted to be on a Zoom screen with us. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for showing up for each other and not just showing up for this newsroom. That really does mean a lot to us. And I hope that comes across in every single event that we've been able to put on. But yes, I mean, the newsletter subscribers, thank you to all of you. It means a lot that so many people are subscribed to the newsletter every single day, that you share it with other people, that you're using it to connect with all of the genders that are in your life. That means a lot to us as we continue to do this work. But yeah, I mean, I think you could not have told me as a pandemic baby that we would have been able to create the community that we have created in just 2 years, but we absolutely feel that love, and as we are getting back out into the world, we feel it even more strongly, and we are just so grateful. I think that the reason that we are able to create this community is because, again, you've got people who are saying, wow, I'm seeing myself, I'm hearing myself for the first time in journalism, in political journalism, right? Whether they were already politically active or whether they had no politics at all, but they give a damn about this country. And they are realizing, hey, I care, these are other people who care, I want to be involved, I want to be a part of this. I think that's what really feels different. And that they are welcome, and that they know that they are welcome here.
I just want to add to that. It is about, we can quantify all of the ways that our audience and our community has grown remarkably over the last 2.5 years, but it is the people who are sharing our stories on social media and saying, I've never seen this in another news organization. Thank you for doing this. I feel seen. And also, it's more, I'm in Austin, and as I've gotten back out in the world, I am meeting people out in my community who are thanking me for the reporting that they're seeing coming out of our newsroom. And we're talking about, transgender teens who are reading our coverage. We're talking about, women of color, other Latinas in my community who may or may not be following politics the way that Inside DC is like plugged into politics. But like, I'm telling y'all, where I live and where I sit, people are gravitating towards our take on political journalism exactly because they are connecting with it on a very personal level. And it's so powerful. And I think I'm really just looking forward, the more that we can get out into the world, even today, in the conversations and the connections that we're able to achieve by being in the room with all of you, we're just really excited to build on the quality of that relationship as we grow.
All right, friends, we've got about 2 minutes left here, so I kind of want to close the conversation the way we started with another round of rapid fire.
I'll try to follow directions.
Sorry, Erin, again. So you've been around for 2.5 years now, and I want to urge you to think really big and think about the next 2.5, the next 3 years. And I promise when I ask you this question, I will not hold you to any of the answers when we hang out again in 2.5 or 3 years. But what is on the wish list? Thinking big is what brought us the 19th. What is on the wish list for the next iteration of the 19th?
I'm going to say a sports reporter, but nobody else is going to follow me up on that yet. So no, I mean,
I will up my membership.
Great. Maybe you can just underwrite it. I would say for me, it is lasting sustainability, knowing that we have the runway in this organization to feel safe and secure from now till kingdom come.
I've been on a major partnerships like research binge, and I really just want to figure out how we fit into this ecosystem of publishers around the country who are already doing really great work, and how can we amplify their excellent ground level journalism, and how can we take some of the resources that we have in our newsroom to help amplify that work and to enhance our journalism. I think we're doing a really terrific job changing the game in national politics and policy, but our reporters are all over the country, and I'm just really excited to see what it looks like to be in collaboration with other publishers and in these spaces that we live in.
Continuing to change the narrative around who gets to participate in this democracy and who gets to say what leadership is going to look like and who gets to stand for leadership. We are already smashing notions of electability, smashing notions of who and what a voter looks like in this country, and I know that by the time we get to 2024, I will not feel like I felt going into the 2020 election, and when you and I were out on the campaign trail and what that looks like and feels like. So looking forward to that.
All right, bring us home, Johanna.
So one of the things I love about the 19th is the sense of belonging that we are building, we have built and are building internally. And one of the things that I'm really excited about, in addition to sustainability, of course, is returning to in-person and going around the country and being able to create that sense of belonging, which I think we already have externally, just continue to grow on that, create that community.
What a great note to leave it on. Thank you all so much. Thank you to Emily, Amanda, Erin, Johanna. Thank you for the 19th.
Thank you.
My legs, no, numb feet, sleepy feet. Thank you, Juana. Alrighty, for our final conversation of this year's 19th Represent Summit, we're talking to two legal heavyweights who are in the trenches fighting for gender and racial equality on multiple fronts. How are they addressing current challenges while also preparing for what comes next? Please welcome Fatima Goss-Graves, President and CEO of the National Women's Law Center, and Maya Wiley, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, for a conversation on the legal fight for gender equality with the 19th's health reporter, Shefali Luthra. Shefali?
Thank you for that introduction, Emily. I am so excited to be here with these two incredible minds and heavyweights in their field. And we have so much to talk about and so many questions from all of you that I am just thrilled to get to. And I know over the past hours and days, we've heard so much about the historical, widespread impact of Title IX. And we've also heard a lot, right, about the areas where growth is still needed. And I would love to start really big picture, and maybe Fatima will start with you first and then go to you, Maya. When you think about what the most radical change was that Title IX wrought, what do you think of first?
So, and Title IX is a radical law. I hope that people really understand that, in part because at the time, discrimination was really routine. in every facet of education, including just plain old rules that you could not enroll in certain schools and that you couldn't be in certain programs. And so passing this law that basically says, stop what you're doing and do something different, that is a radical idea. And so for me, the idea that Title IX's promise of non-discrimination has endured over 50 years. That has been the boon. And in practice, what it has meant is that women are in fields they were not in 50 years ago. Women are participating in sports in the ways that they weren't, that there's an understanding and set of protections around harassment that are basic routine understanding that education programs should not be spaces of discrimination. That has been the win, the understanding and shift that school and learning should be free of discrimination.
Yeah. You know, this is like when you're doing anything with Fatima, all you have to do is say yeah. You know, I think just to underscore what Fatima has said, it's both that we have legal protections, but it's how it shifted our expectations as a society about the role of women, girls, and now folks who are transgender, folks who have different identities about who they are, about their own bodies, in ways that have fundamentally challenged the fundamentalism that said who you were and what you could and could not do just based on who you were. And the reason that is so important, and is always true whenever we protect rights for any group, by the way, right? Always, the more protective we become of people's ability to live full, fair, and opportunity-filled lives, it actually helps everyone, but it makes society a more cohesive, robust, prosperous place. And that's actually what Title IX represents. And I think the importance of that recognition is why the attacks on it are so important to understand what they really represent. It really is trying to take us backward to a time I don't think any of us want to return to, and I damn sure am not going back.
And I mean, sort of building on that, right, I think what you've articulated is just really powerful, what a radical shift this was, and how what it represented in some ways was broader than the text, right, of the law itself. But if you were to sort of think about areas where there was still room to grow, right, the biggest pressing questions that remained, what do you think of first? And Maya, maybe you can start this one.
Oh, okay, there's a list. But having served in a university, and actually, frankly, in every aspect of professional life, we know sexual harassment and sexual assault, you know, literally sexual violence and its impact on our opportunities. And I say "are" intentionally without gendering that, because, you know, frankly, sexual violence happens to everyone. But in particular, you know, what we know about how it happens in institutionalized settings, whether it's schools or the workplace, it is actually a problem that is about power and power over. And it was one of the things we had not, and lots of fights and incredible work, including by organizations like Fatima's, and many organizations to actually say, no, we have to extend these protections through regulations and actually enforce a different kind of accountability to how we're protecting and also enforcing and punishing, quite frankly, whether it's with job loss or getting, you know, expelled, but punishing folks who transcend those boundaries and hurt people, because that's really what we were talking about, and that is clearly work that we are still doing.
Yeah, certainly the agenda around gender-based violence in schools is significant, and at the Law Center we spend a lot of time addressing it in K-12 schools, in high schools, and in middle schools. But some of the areas that are grabbing our attention and where we're spending more time include supporting students who are parents. Disproportionately, women of color are more likely to be in school and parents at the same time, especially in community colleges, and ensuring they have what they need. And then I have to say, we spend a lot of time, unfortunately, thinking about the backlash, the waves of backlash. And that has shown up in the attacks from men's rights groups around addressing schools' efforts to address sexual violence and make schools safer. But it is also showing up in efforts to just do equity on campuses generally. We're seeing attacks that doing trainings in the aftermath of a discrimination complaint, we're seeing that called into account. We're seeing that happen in Virginia, these executive orders that are all for some strange reason labeled critical race theory, even though they aren't. These are anti-rights attacks, and Title IX is a real part of that.
And one thing that I think you're sort of getting at, right, is that this moment that we live in right now is just such a complex moment for Title IX's promise specifically, but also for gender equity broadly, right? I mean, we've talked earlier today about what it means to be a young trans athlete. We are all waiting to see the Supreme Court rule on the Dobbs decision and its implications for abortion rights. We are seeing future concerns about access to contraception. And you talk about backlash, and how do you help us sort of process and understand this moment we are living in right now and what it means for the future of gender equity?
I think it's really important that people understand that these are not separate fights. The fights around banning books and the fights around contraception and abortion and attacks on trans lives and bodies, these aren't separate fights. These are the same fights. And they're also tied up with efforts to suppress vote. And if we take ourselves back to 50 years ago, to 1972, and then Roe coming down in 1973, this was a time of great progress. There was, advancements around their Equal Rights Amendment at that time. There was a very different conversation happening in the country that was movement-led around, what it means to participate in our politics and in our society and in our institutions. We're having that conversation again. We are having that conversation again, and I think that's why we are seeing this backlash come in a range of forms. This sort of idea that you can either opt out of longstanding protections or blow them up entirely and ignore decades of precedent. And it feels really scary. And so I actually think what's most important is that people remember that we are the majority. The majority of people in this country, they don't want to see abortion banned. They don't want to see Title IX eroded. They do not want to see books banned. And surely the more than 90% of women in this country who've used contraception are not trying to have you take it away. So that disconnect, we're going to be in a fight culturally and politically for a while over the future of this country. But I have great confidence that over the long run, we will be okay because we are the majority.
So I won't give you my Virginia colony lecture about the intersections between race, gender, and class in this country. But this is I'll spare you that, but it's just another cosign to what Fatima just said about how this is all wrapped up. I want to use the attack on abortion in this context of why it ain't just about abortion, even though that's a critically important and fundamental right? It's because if you think about what Fatima just said about the time period in the country, and where we were in the early 70s, the civil rights movement having been so impactful and effective, the women's rights movement, the anti-war movement, but we were in movement times that significantly not only challenged but changed the laws and the norms of the country. Well, the first attacks on abortion, which was a widely held, understood, not that there wasn't contestation religiously, but the fundamentalists were not attacking the right to abortion in 1972. They weren't. It took them 6 years after Roe before they started attacking it, and it really started originating out of the attack on segregation academies in the South. The point there isn't that there isn't a real deep disagreement in this country. I'm not washing over whether there is disagreement, whether there are people who have deeply and personally held beliefs about whether abortion is right or wrong. My point is there are intentional strategies to wedge us on gender, on race, on sexual identity, on all these things, right, that have now been labeled the culture wars. The culture wars. It's not a culture war. It's a power war. It's a war about whether or not our democracy is a plural one, whether it's one where we all belong and have a voice, or whether it's one where some of us should shut up, accept what we're given, and do the bidding of a powerful few. And that's why it is about all of us. And when you look at the way that the draft Alito opinion, but we could do this whether we're talking about Title IX, we could do this whether we're talking about abortion, we can do this on voting rights, right, to Fatima's point. But the framing of that opinion, if we take it fully out of the legal terms and the legal arguments about abortion or not abortion, fundamentally it's a roadmap that says none of your fundamental rights are fundamental. They're all up for grabs. And after we dismantled your rights, your voting rights, your ability to vote free of discrimination, your ability, for the government to step in and make it easier, all of that, right? Political gerrymandering, fine. So that the power balance of the majority shifts and becomes subjugated to a structure that is not democratic. I'm still with Fatima on hope, right? But I say that because I believe we have to look really, really clearly down the face of coming authoritarianism and power and democracy for only a few. Look down the face and recognize it's coming for all of us. And that we are here because we have been winning. The retrenchment started 30 years ago, 40 years ago, because we were winning. And what that tells us is when we continue to unite in our fight for fundamental rights across all our rights, that actually we win and we will win.
And, controlling our bodies is on the path to authoritarianism, making you feel hopeless and that there's nothing you can do about it. A court that you can't change has made this rule, so too bad. Live with it. All of that is on the pathway to authoritarianism, and we just have to recognize what it is when we see it.
Since we are on this topic, I'd love to hear a bit more. I mean, if the Supreme Court decision does look like the draft that was leaked, on the issue of abortion specifically, where do we go next?
It's very possible that it looks exactly like that, and it's possible it is written entirely different and has the same outcome. So I hope that folks don't get too caught up in, in Justice Alito changing a word or two here or there. I think what we will see happen is over the course of the year and pretty rapidly over the summer, 26 states immediately ban abortion. Some have already have laws on the books that say as soon as the court does this, we're good. And the ones that don't now have the opportunity to copycat Texas and put in place a ban that has a vigilante-style enforcement mechanism. And so what that will mean in practice is that for people who are seeking abortion, it'll become harder to access. It'll mean that if you have means, maybe you will travel, although states are trying to ban you from traveling. And it will mean that many people, and I predict mostly Black and brown women, will find themselves in contact with the criminal justice system. And we know what that looks like. We have other models where we have seen escalations in the criminal justice system. We know what that does for lives, futures, families, homes. So that's what we're going to see with a giant public health crisis tacked on top. Our systems are not ready for it. Our criminal justice system isn't ready for it, and our healthcare systems aren't ready for it. And so our short-term thing in terms of people who are like, oh, what do I do? So the short-term thing that you can do is work to protect people. Like that sort of short-term mitigating harm is the important thing. But we are going to be in a very long fight for our rights and freedoms and future. We just will be.
So I'm privileged to serve in a 72-year-old civil rights and human rights coalition of 230 groups. 230 that spans all of the issues and work we're talking about, right? And that is increasingly, has always been, because it's a coalition by definition, but it has increasingly been working even more collaboratively and strategically because it's all about all of us. And you know, I think it's so important to do the protection. The protection is also on all these issues. Because we're already hearing from black women who are organizing in the South just to do, you know, voter registration and get out the vote, that they're unsafe doing that. So the protection starts all across the board with, and women's leadership has been critical on all these issues, right, which we also should acknowledge. But here's my point. The fight goes to the states. We fight we protect in the states, and we fight in the states so that we're coming back to the federal government to say, we're building our power, and yes, you will, because we will not stand for this. And one of the thing that we should recognize about dark days, and we are in dark days, which is why we have to think fundamentally about protecting people. We're not going to pretend the sun is shining all day, every day, because it's not on too many people. But what it has done is created more unity, more engagement, more determination, more energy, more organizing. And what that tells us is, you come for us, we get organized. You try to divide us, we unify. And you tell us you're going to shut the doors of federal power, and if stuff's going to get stuck in Congress, we'll win it in the states, and we'll come back knocking down your door. Not violently. We're not talking about January 6th. Not what I mean. But we'll come knocking down your door saying, we lent you this power. Now we're going to tell you how to use it.
I do want to go back, because you both brought up also within Title IX and broadly, right, how we think about sexual violence as well, right? And I know one thing we spoke about earlier was the implications of the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial, which was really something people couldn't stop talking about just a few weeks ago. And my colleague Jen Gerson, who spoke earlier, wrote this piece that I have just sent to everyone I know about how the case's implications could be really devastating for people who are in situations, right, of domestic abuse. And I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on what this case means in the educational system, but also more broadly as we think about what it means to be a survivor in this country.
You know, so I do want people to realize that most people in this country don't have Johnny Depp level resources, a fan base, and bots. So I don't want everyone to automatically assume that their situation is a Johnny Depp situation. And at the same time, it is for sure the case that a risk in coming forward and naming your experience and seeking help has always been that you're going to face some sort of legal bullying. So we have seen a misuse of defamation both in workplace complaints and in student complaints. And it's one of the reasons, frankly, that we launched Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, is so that people who were speaking out and saying Me Too might have attorneys as they were doing so. And at the same time, I just want you to understand, for most students who are coming forward and participating in their systems with their schools, they're not bringing lawyers with them, right? You know, students are filling it out. Maybe you might bring someone with you, but that person might be a friend or an RA, maybe your mom. You know, it's not a legal process, which was one of our major complaints around the Betsy DeVos rule, that they had tried to create a legal process for a lot of people who didn't have lawyers and a lot of systems that weren't set up like courts. And so have heard of students finding themselves on the other end of defamation concerns, and this is something we have to pay close attention to. We might actually need some policy reform to meet the moment. But I don't want people to be left with a feeling like because the way that trial went, that all is lost for survivors. Our movement, our work, the gains that have been made are far stronger than that.
I think that's really true, and I'll tell you what I worry about. So we already know that so many people who are victimized by sexual violence do not report. They do not come forward. That was true before this case. Or people who are abused at home, intimate partner abuse. That has unfortunately and sadly been a long-standing truth for a whole bunch of reasons, right? Including what people stand to lose, how they will be treated, whether they have a place to live. So for so many people, the fundamentals are, I can't leave because I can't afford the housing, let alone feel safe. I mean, so it's so many fundamental issues that are deep and real. But I sat, having given commentary on a Supreme Court justice accused of sexual violence, where you couldn't even get a full investigation into whether someone was going to get a lifetime appointment and have power and decision-making over cases that would even dictate what the law said and meant on issues of sexual violence, could act out in a way that by itself should have meant your confirmation was snatched from you because it was not judicial behavior. Critical point for the job. So we've been here for a while. We've made real advances. The bravery, thinking about Ana Maria Aquila, who came out, of someone I've known for years, didn't know she'd been raped until that hearing. So, I think that when we see examples of also when women step up, not just women, because again, sexual violence happens across our identities, but when people who are victimized step up, it does empower others to do it. And those are the stories we have to make sure people are seeing and hearing, as well as making sure we're paying attention to the policies that give people the ability to leave and be safe.
As you were talking, I was trying to think, is she talking 1991 or is she talking 2018? But go ahead.
Before we run out of time, I do want to go to some of the questions that our viewers have submitted, and I think this one speaks kind of broadly to everything we've discussed so far. And it's from Christy in Santa Fe, and she asks, as we think about the future of gender equity at large, what are the best ways non-legal professionals can take action or get involved?
There is so much that non-lawyers can do, and far more, frankly, than the confines of our legal system. You can engage by signing up and getting information from groups like ours. You can show up at a rally or a protest or a gathering. You can bring your friends along with you. You could share your story if you want to, or support somebody else who's sharing their story. You could donate. You could donate to abortion funds. You can donate to political candidates. And you for sure, in this time, can make sure that those who have power understand, and understand deeply, that they cannot be neutral. This is not a time of neutrality. So whether you are, the dog catcher or the president, a member of Congress, or a state rep, you have a responsibility here. Your corporate leader, you have a responsibility here. This is not a time for the sidelines. This is a time for action. And people as constituents, consumers, donors, voters, they can make that happen.
Completely. Canvassing is another one, because there's so much work to do that's public education work that anybody can do. You don't have to be an expert to be able to break it down to folks, what these things mean in just terms that everyone understands. So a lot of times it's the non-lawyers who do that better than the lawyers and are better messengers, right? Because people are more likely to be persuaded by people they can relate to. and people who can talk to them in the terms they're used to talking to their neighbors, their family members in. And canvassing is both, whether it's for getting out the vote, but we're actually looking at supporting canvassing so that people are being educated on issues as their doors are being knocked. Because what we want is for people to be informed. There's so much misinformation, disinformation, things that people just are being told or hearing or reading. Some of it is intentional. It's straight up intentional, and we counter it in all the ways that Fatima said, in so many different ways. We can just be educated ourselves and share our own information.
Before we wrap up, I want to end on a question that kind of takes stock of where we are in this moment and sort of gives us a forward-looking tone. And so this is two parts. I mean, I guess first, on the federal or state level, are there things that you see happening that you're really excited about, that you want to sort of shout out, that you think are interesting or important as we think about gender equity? And in a bigger picture lens, if the stars aligned and you had Congress, you had the White House, you had the courts, and you could pass the Title IX of now, right, and look back 50 years from now and have this giant policy, what would it be?
I love that, the Title IX of now. I love that saying. So, sometimes we let our wins go by, and I think it's really important that we not do that. This spring, the Violence Against Women Act was reauthorized. This spring, we saw a ban on the use of arbitration for harassment claims in contracts. And the House has passed the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act with more Republican votes than I have seen in any bill, like maybe post offices, I don't know. And it had passed out of the House, the Help Committee, with all but 2 members of that committee. So we are very teed up to see the most protections for pregnant workers that we have seen in decades. So those are good and important things that we're on the cusp of getting. I don't call any of these like freedom bills. They aren't like the liberation. They aren't the Title IX of today, but they will help concretely.
Yeah, first of all, we also should remember in the context of abortion rights, all the states that are moving quickly, rapidly to expand them, right, in response to the states that are working to undermine them. That's really important, and California is actually working to be a place and encourage and support people to come and get an abortion in California. So there's a lot there we could go through to show how much work is winning, particularly at state level in response to what's either not moving federally. The other thing is, but if I'm waving my wand, I'm really going back to voting rights. I'm really going back to making it easier to vote. I'm really going back to the fundamentals of democracy. I'm really going back to civic education in schools. I'm really going back to desegregating those schools. I'm really going back to all the things that started to build a true and inclusive society where we were getting these things in our policy and our politics. And so I say that because when I'm looking at the landscape on the attack on gender equity, again, because it is fundamental to understand how it's attack on people's power. And women, by the way, are more than 50% of this country. So, when we think about where and how we build our democracy, the wands we have to wave right now, we actually can be waving in state level on state legislation on all these things. But it really is the playbook the right used to come to undermine federal legislation on our side that we'd been winning was to start in states and then work their way federal. Well, we're not done. We're not done at federal level, and we got to focus a lot on building that power back.
Maya, Fatima, this has been so much fun. I really enjoyed spending this half hour with you. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks all of you. Thank you, Fatima, Maya, and Shefali for that really powerful conversation. That actually wraps up our 3rd annual summit and our first ever in-person event. It has been really incredible to finally be with all of you in the flesh.
Yes, and a big thank you to everyone who made this year's 19th Represents Summit so special, including all of you who've watched here online, our speakers, our performance, and honestly, a round of applause for the entire 19th team, our newsroom, everyone. That would be awesome. Another big thanks to our presenting sponsors, the Impact Seat Foundation and the Walton Family Foundation, and our supporting sponsors, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, the Girls' Rights Project, the Lumina Foundation, and the Tory Burch Foundation.
We would also like to thank our media partner, USA Today, our academic partner, Arizona State University, and our community partner, the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library here in Washington, D.C.
If you liked what you saw this week, we hope that you'll join the 19th. We're a member-supported newsroom, and we simply cannot put on events like this without the support of people like you. You can join by donating now at 19thnews.org/membership, and you can also support our nonprofit newsroom by signing up for any of our free newsletters at 19thnews.org/subscribe. And speaking of our subscribers, we've got one last item of business before we break for the day. That's to tell you who's going home with our summit giveaway. So, oh, it's right here. Ha! They're so good. All right. The person who is taking home our beautiful curated gift basket with some really sweet 19th swag online is Annie from Apex, North Carolina. I don't know your last name, Annie, but I do know that you're in North Carolina, and I hope that you're watching now. We've got some really fun things headed to you. And in person, who's Kara from DC? Is Kara from DC still here? Should we clap for Kara anyway? Oh, hi. Yay. Looking forward to gifting you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for signing up.
And to those of you who are with us in person, we hope you will please join us outside. I know if you're all as chilly as I finally am in here, join us outside on the 5th floor patio for a closing reception this evening. And to those joining us virtually, thank you so much for spending Friday afternoon with us, spending the rest of the week with us, and we will see you next year. So we'll see you all outside in a minute.